Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. My name is Margaret Winters. Today I run my own business, but 3 decades ago my life was very different. I sold handmade pies from a small cart in the fog-shrouded coastal town of Port Harlow, Maine. It was there that I experienced 2 unforgettable encounters with the supernatural. In those days, my routine began incredibly early. At 2 in the morning, while the lighthouse keeper was still making his final rounds, I was already awake, warming the pies I'd baked the previous evening. My husband had been lost at sea years before, and though my children lived with me, they had their own paths to follow. The weight of supporting our home rested entirely on my shoulders. After rising, I would splash cold water on my face and get dressed, pausing briefly before the small shrine to Saint Christopher I kept near the door. That particular morning, a dense fog had rolled in from the Atlantic, thicker than any I'd seen in years. For a moment, I considered staying home, but I knew that around 2:30, the fishermen would be heading to their boats, and I needed to be ready to serve them. At 2:20, I pushed my cart through the cobblestone streets that, as always at that hour, were completely deserted. The weak glow from the gas lamps barely penetrated the mist, and the path ahead was treacherous with loose stones and puddles. With each step, something inside me urged me to turn back. A shiver crawled up my spine, as if something were terribly out of place. Arriving at my usual spot near the entrance to the pier that descended to the harbor, I began to set up. I arranged the pies, some savory filled with clams and potatoes, others sweet with blueberries and apples, while preparing the coffee and stirring the porridge. I noticed it was almost 3 o'clock, and no one had appeared yet. I sat down on a small wooden stool and waited. That's when I heard the first sound, a long, penetrating lament, filled with a pain that was almost tangible. That moan sent chills through my entire body. At first, I thought it might be one of the women from town suffering from some tragedy, perhaps the loss of a child. But I quickly realized that this sound didn't come from a single place. It seemed to circle around me. I stood up nervously, looking in all directions. The fog suddenly became still, and silence enveloped everything. The crying, growing ever closer, seemed to surround me, but I couldn't see anything until the 3rd lament. Then I saw her, a tall, thin female figure wearing a gray dress similar to a Victorian morning gown. She was floating, motionless, just a few yards away from me near the edge of the pier. Although her face was covered by a veil, I felt her watching me. In that moment, I knew who she was, the Gray Lady. I had always heard the stories, but thought they were just local folklore. Finding courage from I know not where, I shouted, "Who's there?" The figure didn't respond, only began to slowly move away toward the water. She didn't walk, but glided through space, leaving a trail of cold mist behind her. My legs grew weak, and fear overwhelmed me when she let out another cry, this time more distant, from somewhere down the harbor. What they said was true. If you heard her nearby, she was actually far away, and vice versa. My heart was racing, and I could barely move. When she disappeared, the wind returned, and the ambient sounds, the creaking of ship masts, The distant bell buoy broke the silence. About half an hour later, the first fishermen began to appear. Everyone in town had heard the laments and preferred not to leave their homes so early. I returned home at noon, still trembling and praying without ceasing. But that wasn't the only strange experience I lived through. Many years later, around the same hour, while organizing my vending spot, something even more frightening happened, at least to me. This time I wasn't alone. Some fishermen were there with me. As I handed a small bench to a young man, I heard one of them comment on something that made us all turn to look. There, over the water, we saw a light. It looked like a ball of fire floating from side to side. At first, we thought it might be a lantern from a distant boat or someone with a torch, but we soon realized it was nothing of the sort. Suddenly, other balls of fire began to appear from the direction of the cliffs and descended, gathering as if dancing in a circle. At that moment, I remembered the stories my grandparents told about the sea witches. They said these creatures appeared as balls of fire to drain the energy from people. I had always been skeptical about such things, but there, faced with what our eyes were witnessing, I understood it was true. The witches existed and were right in front of us. I gripped tightly the silver anchor pendant I always wear around my neck and began to pray. Meanwhile, the fishermen, perhaps in an attempt to chase away their fear, began shouting insults and threats at the lights. To our surprise, they moved away, rising and disappearing into the darkness. That early morning was suffocating. All of us were terrified, cold sweat coating our skin after what we had witnessed. I spent the rest of the day completely lost in thought, confused, as if I were in a trance. Before I knew it, I was back home without even remembering how I'd gotten there. This encounter marked me deeply and taught me how to deal with the fears I carry. Today, in the 2020s, I continue selling my pies, but I no longer risk going out in the middle of the night. Even so, I never fail to carry my silver pendant and a small bottle of blessed sea salt every day. I often wonder if I will have another encounter with the otherworldly residents of Port Harlow. The Gray Lady and the Fire Witches have never returned to me, but sometimes, when the fog grows thick and the wind dies down, I feel them watching, waiting for me to venture out again into that space between worlds that exists only in the darkest hours before dawn. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My name is Jack, and mountain biking has always been my greatest passion. I live in a small town nestled in the Appalachian foothills, which allows me to grab my bike after work and climb some slope to escape the chaos and find my tranquility. I never imagined that this peaceful routine would be interrupted in such an unexpected way. I remember every detail. It was a Friday evening in late autumn. I had set out as usual, but ended up getting more distracted than normal. I lost track of time while watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. When I finally noticed, stars were already appearing, and my watch showed it was past 8 o'clock. I was still far from home, at least 7 miles up winding mountain trails. I wasn't too concerned. After all, I knew these trails like the back of my hand, and always carried a headlamp attached to my helmet for situations just like this. I switched on the light, picked up my pace, and felt the crisp night air hitting my face, while the only sound accompanying me was that of my tires crunching over the forest path. As I continued my journey, enchanted by the night's serenity, something unusual caught my attention in the sky. At first, I thought it was a meteor since I saw an intense, rapid light crossing the horizon. However, the light didn't disappear. It began to grow and approach. I considered it might be a small aircraft, but then it stopped abruptly midair and began a slow descent. It didn't resemble anything I had ever seen before. I continued pedaling, intrigued, until an unusual sensation coursed through my body. The air around me felt electrified, charged with energy. It was so intense that I had to stop. When I looked up again, I saw the light descending toward an old abandoned mine shaft about 100 yards away. My heart raced, and I hesitated between continuing home or investigating. Curiosity won out. I turned off my headlamp to avoid detection and hid behind a cluster of pine trees. From there, I clearly saw the light hovering at the entrance of the mine shaft, no more than 200 feet away. There was no doubt in my mind. It was some kind of craft. It had the shape of a disc, not very large, but surrounded by brilliant lights that shifted colors. Deep indigo, emerald green, crimson red, and blinding white. They were so bright they illuminated everything around, as if it were midday. The atmosphere seemed to pulse with energy. I felt an invisible force pushing against me. Yet simultaneously, I couldn't move, as if trapped in some kind of magnetic field. The craft floated just a few yards from the mine entrance, slowly rotating on its axis. The silence was nearly absolute, interrupted only by a deep, continuous humming that seemed to emanate from the energy field around it. Suddenly, the lights intensified, and the craft became motionless in the air, as if observing or waiting for something. My breathing grew rapid, my chest felt constricted, and my hands trembled so violently I nearly dropped my bike. Then something even more unexpected happened. A beam of light, almost solid in appearance, extended from the bottom of the craft toward the mine entrance. Within this light, I could make out shadowy figures moving, 3 or perhaps 4 of them descending to the ground. Though distant, they appeared tall and slender, moving with an unnatural fluidity. For nearly 20 minutes, these figures remained at the mine entrance, occasionally moving in and out of my line of sight. I remained frozen, afraid even the sound of my breathing might give me away. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures ascended back into the craft via the same beam of light. The moment they were aboard, the craft shot upward toward the sky with incredible speed, vanishing in seconds. The displacement of air from its departure was so strong that the trees swayed violently, and I nearly lost my balance. After that, silence returned abruptly. The energy dissipated as if it had never existed. I jumped to my feet, overtaken by fear and the adrenaline rushing through my body. Grabbing my bike, I began pedaling with all my strength as if my survival depended on it. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to discover if something was following me. My only concern was getting home as quickly as possible. When I finally arrived, I locked the door in a hurry and collapsed onto the couch, trying to catch my breath. My body was still trembling, And every time I closed my eyes, those lights and the sensation of that energy returned to my mind. That night, sleep was impossible. I spent days unable to return to the mountain, consumed by a mixture of apprehension and uncertainty. To this day, I'm not exactly sure what I witnessed, but I believe it was a UFO, a craft from another world. The strangest part, 2 weeks later, local news reported unusual mineral formations discovered in that exact mine shaft. Geologists were baffled by their composition, calling it unlike anything naturally occurring on Earth. And sometimes, on clear nights, I still see unusual lights hovering over those mountains, too purposeful to be stars, too silent to be planes. I haven't told many people about what I saw. Who would believe me? But I know what I witnessed that night changed my understanding of our place in the universe forever. Today, I'm going to share something that isn't about me or part of my own history. Several years ago, during a conversation with my friend Rebecca, she revealed something that I've never been able to get out of my head. We were gathered on a quiet afternoon, sipping tea, when the conversation took an unexpected turn. I asked about her previous jobs, and that's when she, with a serious look and a somewhat somber tone, began talking about her experience as a caretaker at an elementary school in rural New England during the late 70s. Rebecca explained that she had accepted the job out of financial necessity. In addition to maintaining the grounds, she needed to live there. In the back corner of the school property, there was a small brick cottage with a slate roof, with just enough space for a bed, a modest wardrobe, and a makeshift kitchen. It was all very simple, but for her, it was sufficient. However, what she experienced there left deep marks that never faded. While classes were in session, everything ran smoothly. During the day, children's laughter and shouts filled the place. At night, when silence took over, Rebecca even found a certain peace in the solitude of the empty environment. But that changed radically during winter break. It was during this period, when the place was completely deserted under heavy snowfall, that Rebecca began to witness things she couldn't explain. On the first night, while trying to sleep as winds howled outside, she heard a sharp sound coming from the corridor near the gymnasium. She thought it was her imagination, or perhaps the old building settling in the cold. But as the noises continued, she decided to go check. She found nothing. She returned to her room, locked the door, and tried to ignore it. But the following nights were even more disturbing. She began to hear screams coming from the classrooms, childlike voices that cried, lamented, or seemed to be calling her name. Sometimes she would gather courage and go investigate, but everything remained empty, immersed in silence. The worst part was that as soon as she returned to her cottage, the sounds would start again. Rebecca described, her eyes still tense after all these years, how these screams seemed to enter directly into her head. Beyond that, other sounds began to emerge. Desks being dragged across classroom floors, knocks on the blackboards, quick footsteps in the courtyard. Sometimes in the dead of night, she would hear the noise of the swings moving or the sound of the merry-go-round spinning by itself in the playground, despite being covered in snow. When she looked through the window, she saw the playground equipment moving even though there wasn't a breath of wind or sign of any human presence. It was terrifying, she told me, still visibly shaken. I never believed in ghosts, but it was as if that elementary school decided to come alive when everybody was gone. Like the rooms and hallways had their own will, she said, still impressed by the memory. Despite her fear, Rebecca knew she couldn't leave the job. She desperately needed the money and had nowhere else to go. When classes resumed after the break, she kept everything secret, including from the teachers and the principal. They seemed to suspect something, she whispered, leaning closer to me. Sometimes they would ask if I had heard anything unusual, but I always denied it. I didn't want them to think I was making things up or that I was crazy, she confessed. As the weeks passed, Rebecca found a way to deal with what happened at night. She reluctantly got used to the screams that echoed in the empty classrooms, the footsteps in the corridor, and the sounds of playground equipment that seemed to move on its own. Although it was difficult, she forced herself to believe that it was all just unexplainable noises, old pipes, the wind, or the building settling. But then she shared something even more disturbing with me. One particularly cold night in February, she woke to find her room filled with what looked like ghostly figures of children, all staring at her with hollow eyes. They didn't speak or move toward her, they just watched. Paralyzed with fear, she lay in bed until dawn broke, when they slowly faded away with the morning light. It was like I had reached an agreement with the place, she said softly. I wouldn't interfere with them, and they wouldn't do anything to harm me. I would acknowledge their presence, and they would give me space to live. What made her story even more chilling was what she discovered in the spring. While helping the principal organize some old files, she came across newspaper clippings from 1932 that reported a terrible fire at the school that had claimed the lives of 15 children who had been trapped in the East Wing, the same wing where her cottage was located and where she most frequently heard the noises. Rebecca remained in that job for many years, despite never fully understanding what she had experienced. Everything she heard, saw, and felt left a deep mark on her memory. She couldn't say exactly what it was, but she believed there was a presence in that elementary school, something that simply wouldn't dissipate. As I listened to her account, I was speechless. Every detail Rebecca described, the honest and intense tone of her voice, sent chills down my spine. Sometimes I wonder if those children are still there, playing in empty hallways long after the final bell has rung. When I was 7 years old, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were all the rage at my elementary school. Every kid my age couldn't stop talking about them, collecting action figures, trading cards, and some even had backpacks and lunchboxes with the characters on them. I wasn't part of that group. At my house, we only got toys for Christmas or birthdays. Not that I cared much, or at least that's what I tried to convince myself. Then one evening, my dad came home with an unexpected surprise. A small Raphael action figure, my favorite Ninja Turtle. It was just the right size to fit in the palm of my hand, and that permanent scowl on his face always made me laugh. Dad said he'd found it at a yard sale just down the block. I was ecstatic. For weeks, that figure went everywhere with me. It became my bedtime companion, sitting on my nightstand watching over me as I slept. That's when things started getting weird. At first, it was subtle. I'd place the figure in a specific position on my nightstand before falling asleep, But in the morning, it would be somewhere else, sometimes on the floor, other times on my dresser, and occasionally even on the windowsill across the room. I figured maybe I was knocking it over in my sleep, or perhaps my little sister was playing tricks on me. One night, something different happened. I woke up around midnight because I felt my bed shift slightly. I thought it might be our dog trying to jump up, but when I turned on my bedside lamp, there was nothing there except Raphael sitting at the edge of my mattress, as if he was about to fall off. Perfectly still, but definitely not where I'd left him. In my childish mind, I thought it was amazing. I imagined the action figure was actually alive, just like in the cartoon. This even excited me for a while. In the following nights, similar incidents began happening more frequently. I'd wake up in the early hours and see the figure moving, its small plastic feet making faint scratching sounds across my bedroom floor. It would often stop in a corner, as if observing something. I wasn't scared. To me, it was like a secret game between us. I never mentioned it to anyone. But gradually, things took a darker turn. One night, I felt something pressing down on my chest. When I opened my eyes, there was Raphael sitting on top of me. His plastic arms and legs splayed out as if he was staring right at me. The sensation of weight was unmistakably real. As the days passed, this got worse. The figure seemed to grow heavier each night, to the point where it became uncomfortable. It began to worry me, but not enough to tell my parents. Until one night, when the weight became unbearable. I felt the figure climbing up my body, and when it settled on my chest, it felt like someone had placed a brick there. I could barely breathe. That morning, I finally told my mom everything. How the figure moved on its own, how it appeared on top of me while I slept, and how the weight seemed to increase every night. I expected her to dismiss it as just a dream or my overactive imagination. But to my surprise, she turned pale. That same night, both my parents came to my room. My dad picked up the figure, examined it with suspicious eyes, and muttered something to my mom about these old toys sometimes carrying bad energy. Without hesitation, he took the figure outside and threw it into the fire pit in our backyard. My mom said a prayer and sprayed holy water around my room. I stayed in bed, confused and slightly terrified. That night was the first time I slept peacefully in weeks. The figure never reappeared in my room. The next day, out of curiosity, I checked the fire pit, but there was nothing left but ashes. Now, as an adult, I can see that what happened was far from normal. It wasn't dreams or imagination. Those were paranormal events. Just thinking about that Raphael figure walking across my room, or the light scratching steps I felt on my chest, still gives me goosebumps. Sometimes I find myself wondering what might have happened if I hadn't told my parents. Would the figure have gone further? What exactly was its intention? I prefer not to find out. What you sow, one day you must reap. In the late 80s, life seemed simpler in some ways, but also carried its own measure of brutality. In small towns like mine in rural Oregon, rules didn't come from laws but from gossip and prejudices that circulated freely. People could be generous, but they didn't hesitate to judge, and they punished even faster. Decades have passed, But one story from that time is still whispered by the elders, marked in the stones of the fields, and in the memory of those who witnessed it. I was young then, just beginning to understand the weight of being a woman in a place where life was defined by hard work and by the fear of what will people think. It was then that the Blackwood sisters and their mother, Ms. Eleanor, arrived in our town. What happened next turned their names into a dark echo that still resonates on cold nights. Little was known about their origin. One day they simply appeared, occupying a small house on the outskirts near the forest, where many worked under the merciless sun. It was an old construction with worn walls and a roof on the verge of collapsing. But the Blackwoods didn't complain. Together, they transformed that place into their home. Ms. Eleanor was serious and a woman of few words, but there was something in her gaze that made anyone look away. She claimed to be a widow, though she never mentioned her husband. Her daughters, Amelia, Rebecca, and Grace, were young and each attracted attention in her own way. Amelia, the eldest, possessed a glacial, intimidating beauty that kept the curious at a distance. Rebecca, the middle child, was more affable, but seemed to weigh every word before speaking. Grace, the youngest, had a dreamy manner with a light laugh that sounded out of place in such a stern town. From the beginning, their arrival generated gossip. Some men tried to court them, but the sisters always maintained their distance, fueling malicious whispers. "They're as strange as their mother," some women would say at the market. "They never appear in church. What could they be hiding?" others speculated. However, the Blackwoods weren't looking for trouble. It was the opposite. Trouble found them. Everything began on a hot summer afternoon when Amelia went to fetch water from the communal well. It used to be a meeting place for the town women, but that afternoon it was empty except for Travis, a man known for his bad temper and passion for drinking. "How lucky to find you alone," Travis said with a smile that inspired no confidence. Amelia ignored him and began to fill her pitcher, but he moved even closer. "No need to be rude, girl. I just want to chat." Before he could touch her, Amelia turned and stared directly at him. What happened next is difficult to explain. Travis backed away, mumbling something incomprehensible. He stumbled as if losing his balance and ran off, leaving Amelia alone. Later, he told some friends what had occurred, and that same night, he began to act strangely. He claimed to hear voices calling his name when he was alone. He started having sleepless nights, and neighbors affirmed they heard him screaming in the dark. In less than 7 days, he lost his mind, and his family had to send him to another town to seek help. Travis's case didn't go unnoticed. Although concrete evidence was lacking, suspicions against the Blackwood sisters began to grow. Rumors, like a flame on dry straw, spread quickly. They said Ms. Eleanor was seen gathering herbs at sunrise, while others swore they had spotted mysterious lights around their house during the night. "They're witches without a doubt," declared Martha, the town midwife. "And those girls have something that's not of this world." My mother, always discreet, advised me, "Don't get involved with them. Whatever they are, it's better to keep your distance." But the men in town didn't heed Travis's fate. For many, the sisters were an enigma they needed to unravel or dominate. Jack, Ethan, and Liam, 3 young men known for their arrogance, decided to confront them. One night, they followed the Blackwoods to their house, just after they returned from the market. What happened afterward remains a mystery. But the next morning, the three appeared in the town square in a deplorable state. Jack had lost his voice. Ethan sobbed uncontrollably, and Liam kept repeating that something was pursuing him in the shadows. They were taken to the church, but not even the pastor could help them. Fear took hold of the community. Stories about the Blackwoods soon transformed into legends. Some said they summoned the dead. Others claimed they had made a pact with evil forces. But no one dared to face them directly. The situation reached its limit when Richard, a farmer known for his violent temperament, decided to act. He gathered a group of men armed with machetes and torches, intending to drive the Blackwoods out of town. That night the sky was heavy with clouds, and the dense air seemed to announce something tragic. From my house, I heard the shouts, and saw through the window the group advancing toward the outskirts, torches illuminating the dirt path. I wanted to intervene, but I knew it was futile. When they reached the sisters' house, they found it empty. The interior was icy cold, and a strange odor, like wet earth mixed with sulfur, hung in the air. On the wall was a phrase written in ashes: "The damage you sow, you shall reap." That night marked the beginning of the town's ruin. The absence of the Blackwood sisters brought no relief. On the contrary, it increased the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The next morning, the real consequences began to manifest. The sun illuminated a paralyzed town. The fields, previously resistant to drought, were completely destroyed. The corn and bean plantations had carbonized leaves, as if an invisible fire had consumed them. Fruit trees, once a source of food and shade, had dry, twisted branches pointing to the sky like skeletal fingers. Not even the animals escaped. Cows, goats, and horses, the livelihood of many families, fell inexplicably ill. Some stopped eating, while others went mad, running in circles until they dropped dead. At first, people tried to find rational explanations, but it didn't take long for them to accept what they feared most. The Blackwood sisters had cursed the town. The message written in ashes on the wall of their house became an impossible to ignore warning. "The damage you sow, you shall reap." Many began to reflect whether the curse had been provoked not just by the abuses some had tried to commit, but also by the judgment that the entire town had cast upon the Blackwoods. Fear and desperation spread like a plague. Food became scarce, and families who lived off what the land offered began to fiercely dispute the few remaining resources. Some tried to flee, but stories about what happened to those who dared to carry the curse with them kept them trapped there. "Better to face the end here than spread this evil to others," said Walter, one of the most respected elders. As days passed, reports about the Blackwood sisters grew stranger. Some swore they had seen them walking through the fields under the moonlight, wearing white dresses that glowed in the dark. Others claimed to hear their laughter on the wind, mocking the men who had tried to persecute them. Martha, the midwife, claimed to have spotted Ms. Eleanor gathering herbs near the well. "I don't know if it was them or their spirits," she whispered once, with wide eyes, "but I feel they haven't finished what they started." My mother, always sensible, tried to keep me away from these stories, but the fear in the air was impossible to ignore. We all felt that our town would never be the same. Over time, families began to abandon their homes. The few that remained tried to rebuild their lives, but the land seemed cursed, unable to support any new plantation. Animals continued to waste away, and the fields remained sterile. Gradually, houses were left behind, and the market became an empty place. One morning, overcome by a mixture of nostalgia and curiosity, I walked to the Blackwoods' house. It was still standing, but barely recognizable. The walls were covered with moss, the roof had collapsed, and everything there seemed dominated by abandonment. However, the message written in ashes was still there, intact on the wall, a dark reminder of what had happened. Now, so many years later, the town is nothing but a memory. Few families remained, and the land never became fertile again. The elders still talk about the Blackwood sisters, some with bitterness, others with acceptance, and a few with regret. Perhaps the mistake was ours, not theirs. Walter, the only elder who still lives, confided in me many years ago. Perhaps they only returned to us what we gave to them. The fate of the sisters remains a mystery. Some believe they fled to another place, while others think they joined something darker, something that gave them the power to repay the evil they suffered. And they say that on full moon nights, when the wind blows stronger, it's still possible to hear among the whispers the words of that message. The damage you sow, you shall reap. In the abandoned fields where nothing grows anymore, I sometimes think I see 3 silhouettes moving between the trees at dusk. Perhaps it's just my imagination, perhaps it's the weight of memory, or perhaps, just perhaps, the Blackwood sisters are still watching over what remains of the town that rejected them, ensuring their lesson is never forgotten. I've never told anyone, but once, on a particularly cold winter night as I walked home alone, I swear I heard Grace's distinctive laughter carried on the wind. And for just a moment, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw Ms. Alina standing by the old well, her eyes fixed on me with that penetrating gaze. But when I turned to look directly, there was only emptiness and the soft falling snow covering the scars of our land, a white shroud over the sins we can never truly escape. You know those stories that begin as casual conversations about family history and suddenly turn into something impossible to forget? That's exactly the kind of story I'm about to share with you. There's no way to tell this without getting emotionally involved, because it feels so real that you can almost imagine yourself there, experiencing everything alongside us. My grandparents originally came from rural Vermont and the mountains of West Virginia. They moved to Boston in the late 60s to build a new life, starting with simple row houses that they gradually improved over time. My great-grandmother accompanied them from the beginning. They used to tell an unusual story. At dusk, a woman would descend from the hill where they lived. No one knew where she came from. She would stay at the community washing station, scrubbing clothes for hours. They only saw her from a distance in the darkness. When she finished, she would walk to an old maple tree and mysteriously seem to disappear there. For my great-grandmother, this wasn't something frightening. She described it as if it were just another peculiarity of the place, something absolutely ordinary. As time passed, my grandfather managed to build his own house where 7 children lived, 4 daughters and 3 sons. Eva, one of the daughters, began experiencing unusual things, tugs on her hair and clothes, and whispers of her name. The strangest part was that When she searched for the source of these occurrences, she found no one. She was completely alone each time it happened. Eva was only 18 years old then. These events, however, became more frequent and disturbing. One night, she was in her bedroom with my Aunt Miriam. The room had distinctive features: a carpet covering the floor and an enormous bookshelf occupying the entire wall opposite the bed. These details might seem trivial, but they're crucial for what happened next. Eva was almost asleep, lying face down, when she heard the distinctive sound of the door lock being turned. She always locked her door, and no one else had a key. Slowly, the doorknob began to turn, almost inaudibly, but noticeable enough. The door then opened gradually, emitting a slight creak before closing again as carefully as it had opened. Shortly after, footsteps began to echo on the carpet. They were unmistakable, each producing a muffled noise. The footsteps approached until they stopped beside Eva. Even with fear taking over, she opened her eyes. There she saw the silhouette of a woman with long hair, leaning very close to her face. It was impossible to identify her features because of the darkness, but Eva knew it wasn't anyone she recognized. Suddenly, with sounds reminiscent of cracking bones, the figure slowly rose, only to climb onto the bed and walk across Eva's back. The weight was unbearable. Each step pressed down on her spine from the base all the way to the nape of her neck. Eva could barely breathe, such was the force she felt. The mattress sank beneath that strange weight. After what seemed like an eternity, the woman got off the bed, leaned in again as if to look closely at Eva, and left the room. On her way out, she knocked several books from the large bookshelf, leaving behind a feeling of uneasiness and mystery. My Aunt Miriam, instead of being frightened, became more irritated by the events. One night, she decided to sprinkle holy water throughout the room, determined to see if it would drive away the woman. After that, whatever it was, perhaps the figure my great-grandmother had mentioned, or even a witch, she and my Aunt Eva decided to sleep holding hands. That way, if something happened, Eva would squeeze Miriam's hand to alert her. Unfortunately, the events repeated during the night. Eva gently squeezed Miriam's hand, and immediately the lights were turned on. When they looked, there was a handprint on Eva's face, the result of a slap. Miriam, filled with fury, spread more holy water around the room, shouting insults, some familiar. Others improvised, hoping to permanently drive away that disturbing presence. Upon examining Eva, they discovered another handprint on her neck. The days passed, and Eva began to deteriorate. Sleep deprivation, lack of appetite, and the constant torment from that entity began to take their toll. One day, alone at home and busy with household chores, Eva heard the sound of doors slamming upstairs. The noise was muffled by music and the movement of her broom, but it soon caught her attention. Despite her fear, she decided to check, finding a small door open. She closed it, making sure all doors were securely locked, and went back downstairs. Shortly after, while returning to her tasks, the doors began to slam again, this time with much greater force, resonating throughout the house. It made her blood run cold, though the sound seemed different, more aggressive than before. Eva, with her heart racing, decided to go upstairs again. The idea of an intruder seemed more plausible than that of a supernatural entity. She climbed the stairs slowly, the noise growing increasingly deafening until she reached the landing where the bedrooms were located. Between the first two bedrooms, a terrifying sight awaited her. A female figure hovering there, about 18 inches from the floor. She was an elderly woman with a cadaverous appearance, disheveled and dirty hair, deep, hollow eyes, and a disproportionately large mouth. Her contorted features overflowed with rage, but remained silent, as if the fury was contained. The fixed eyes and contracted mouth intensified the sense of threat. Eva, about 15 feet from the figure, felt her entire body paralyze. Every muscle seemed trapped, as if weighing tons. But in an immense effort, she managed to break through the blockade of fear and ran out of the house, her legs feeling as if they were made of cement. Outside, she collapsed in tears, trembling and unable to articulate words. That's where my grandparents found her when they returned from the market. They took her in, trying to calm her as best they could. Depression took over my Aunt Eva's life amid this constant torment of something no one could explain. Her daily routine was filled with tension. Although she continued with her usual tasks, she lived in a state of alertness, always looking around, paying attention to any unusual sound. The nights which should have brought rest became moments of pure terror. One night after leaving the shower, she went to my grandfather's room to get a comb, as many of us do. She reached out to find the light switch beside the door, but instead felt another hand, an icy one, firmly grabbing her wrist. She let out a scream that, according to her, was the loudest and most frightening of her life. The entire family rushed to the hallway and found her in shock, with a clear, red handprint on her wrist. However, there was no one there, nor any logical explanation for what had happened. Not knowing how to handle the situation, my grandparents and uncles began to question Eva's sanity. They believed that perhaps she was suffering from schizophrenia, since no one else had witnessed or experienced anything similar. They sought medical help and took her for psychological and psychiatric consultations, insisting on ruling out mental health problems. But meanwhile, the phenomena continued. The apparitions and strange events in the house became even more frequent. One of our great-aunts, very devout and full of faith, decided to intervene. She decided to perform a kind of exorcism, ritual, to try to expel what she believed to be a malevolent entity. It wasn't a formal exorcism, of course, but she wanted to help somehow. I don't know all the details, but some things were told to me. She began with the prayer of Saint Michael the Archangel and held a Bible as she proceeded. During the ritual, a picture of the Virgin Mary in Eva's room shattered. At the same time, the drawers began to vibrate. Books flew from the shelves, and some even tore or were destroyed upon impact. All this happened before their eyes, increasing their terror. My great-aunt, Eva, and my mother fled the house, unable to face what they were experiencing. No one knew for sure why these events were directed specifically at Eva. She ended up staying with relatives for a while. When she returned to the house, the torment had ceased. Gradually, she began to sleep well again, regained her health, and lived without further strange episodes. Still, no one ever fully understood what had happened. They were just relieved that everything had ended. But the story didn't end there. Years later, when my Aunt Christina, affectionately called Tina, turned 14, she began seeing an elderly woman in different corners of the house. This lady appeared especially, when Tina was alone in a room. The most peculiar thing was what she carried: a cross of perpetual help and a small bag that she always tried to offer to my aunt, insistently extending her hand. Although my aunt described everything clearly, she never accepted what the woman offered, especially because of my great-grandmother's warnings to never take something of that kind. After the first appearances, in which that old woman merely appeared and insisted that my Aunt Tina take the small bag, her constant refusal seemed to have awakened the entity's wrath. What was passive began to become threatening. Once Tina was in my Uncle Mark's room watching a music video. She got up from the bed to go to the bathroom, but without taking her eyes off the TV, reached out to turn on the light as she entered. When she looked at the toilet, there was the old woman, this time floating a few inches above the floor, hunched over and holding a can of black grease, which she threw against the wall. The explosion of paint left marks everywhere, a visual disaster, and for my aunt, an emotional one. Tina screamed so loudly that everyone in the house heard and ran to help her. My mother was called urgently. They said Tina was in a terrible state. Upon arriving at my grandmother's house, she found the bathroom with walls stained black and illuminated only by a candle, placed as an attempt to give light to the soul of that entity. Tina was trembling, unrecognizable with fear. My mother always says that she never saw my aunt so terrified. However, my grandfather gave no credit to what she said. For him, it was just a way to get attention, and he insisted on the idea that Tina, like Eva before her, was suffering from schizophrenia. He didn't consider the possibility that something beyond, something evil, could be in the house, focused on tormenting the women in the family. But why only them? Tina's health, both physical and emotional, began to deteriorate, just as had happened with Eva. Even so, my grandfather maintained his skeptical view, ignoring the impact of what she was going through. The situation worsened when the old woman began to follow her outside the house. Tina saw her in the school corridors, walking slowly, staring with a look that froze her soul. Once she even peered through the classroom window, paralyzing Tina, who couldn't tell anyone for fear of being ridiculed. At home, where she should have found safety, she was called crazy. What would her classmates say? Going to the school bathroom alone became impossible. On one of these occasions, the old woman appeared, locked Tina in a stall, and slapped her face. Tina was in shock and needed the help of her sister Teresa, who also studied at the school, to get out of there. The entire family was on the verge of despair. They didn't know how to fight against something invisible to them, but clearly tangible to Tina and Eva. It wasn't just the psychological impact. The physical marks on the victims' bodies were evident, adding an even more frightening element. For some reason, the old woman seemed to have disappeared for a time, as if she had decided to stay away. Everyone began to believe that the torment had ended. Tina gradually managed to recover part of her health. However, 4 years later, when she reached adulthood, the entity returned. The return of that presence was noticed during a family gathering at my grandmother's house. My mother always said that after the previous events, the atmosphere of the house was never the same. Any moment alone in a room was enough to cause a chill. That day in the morning, they asked her to fetch an iron from one of my aunt's rooms. Upon opening the door, she heard the sound of a poorly tuned radio coming from inside. Terrified, she ran downstairs and told my grandmother what had happened. She, although calling my mother a scaredy cat, decided to accompany her to check. When they entered the room, they found a radio thrown under the dressing table, emitting that strange noise. My grandmother picked up the device and saw that it wasn't plugged into the outlet. It had the option to run on batteries, but none were installed. At that moment, the radio simply turned off by itself. Trying to stay calm, my grandmother commented that it must be residual energy, an explanation that my mother found absurd since the device hadn't been used for years. However, it was easier to believe that than to consider other possibilities. The hours passed, and as the gathering ended, some uncles left. Only my grandparents, my Aunt Teresa, Tina, and my mother remained. Everyone was engaged in their own activities, when suddenly a scream from the bathroom echoed through the house. Everyone ran there, including my Aunt Eva, who had just arrived from downtown. They found the bathroom completely dirty with toothpaste, on the walls, on the mirror, and even on the ceiling. The strangest things were the drawings and symbols made with the paste, something no one could understand. My grandparents' house had a very high ceiling, which made it impossible for someone to have reached the top to do that without some kind of equipment. The idea of it being a bad joke was quickly dismissed. Without explanations, they simply cleaned up the mess because dinner was approaching. To everyone's relief, that night was peaceful with no further events. However, the next day, while each person was in a different room, another scream cut through the air, this time coming from my Aunt Tina's bedroom. They ran there and found her crouched down with her nose bleeding heavily, and a huge, completely red handprint on her cheek. She was between the wardrobe and the television, which now had a cracked screen and was on the floor. A broken perfume bottle scattered pieces and liquid across the floor. The scene was one of complete chaos. Desperate, they asked what had happened and who had done it. Tina, in shock, couldn't answer, she just cried. It was at this moment that even my grandfather, the most skeptical in the house, began to believe in the figure that everyone believed was behind everything. His explanation of schizophrenia no longer seemed so plausible in the face of what they were seeing. Given Tina's state, they gave her a sedative, which made her the only one to sleep that night. The rest of the family, including my grandfather, remained awake, overcome by fear. The next day, calmer, my Aunt Tina told what had happened. She said she was sleeping when she felt a strong blow to her head that immediately woke her up. Upon opening her eyes, she saw the old woman floating above her bed, staring at her with that fixed, disturbing gaze. The woman made repeated gestures, signaling with her hand for Tina to approach or follow her. Tina was completely paralyzed by fear. All she could do was close her eyes when she realized the woman was preparing to slap her again. The slap was so hard that it made her react. She tried to leave the room, but she was so nervous that her hands were shaking, and she couldn't turn the doorknob. Desperate, she looked back and saw the old woman picking up a perfume bottle from the shelf and throwing it in her direction. By reflex, she managed to dodge, but the bottle hit the television screen, breaking it into pieces. After that, Tina huddled in the corner of the room where they found her. If no one had arrived in time, things might have got even worse. That same morning, the family decided to call a spiritual medium who lived across the street. He already knew the story and the events, but until then, they had never allowed him to intervene. When he entered, he performed a spiritual cleansing, going through all the rooms of the house. He said that the situation would be calm for a while, but warned that it wasn't a common ghost. It was something malicious that interacted directly with people and objects, following its victims even outside the house, causing both physical and emotional damage. Since these events, 30 years have passed. My family still lives in the house, and fortunately, that thing has never touched anyone again. The apparitions inside the house completely ceased after my father, my grandfather, and my uncle passed away. However, neighbors still occasionally report seeing an unknown female figure standing on the roof, looking toward the street. Although we are relieved that she no longer attacks, we know that as long as she remains nearby, there is always the possibility that everything will begin again. After celebrating Independence Day with friends, my husband and I returned to our apartment to end the evening. Despite enjoying the company of others, we're essentially homebodies at heart. We lived in a corner penthouse of an upscale building in downtown Chicago. Rumors circulated, though never confirmed, that the owners planned to convert it into luxury condominiums. The rent was steep, and access to our floor was restricted. In the building's entrance, there was a small lobby with 2 security doors. Sometimes a doorman would be there to greet residents, but not that night. The place was equipped with numerous cameras throughout the interior and exterior. It was an unusually cold July night for Chicago. The temperature had dropped unexpectedly after the fireworks display. It was nearly 3 in the morning. The lobby was empty, except for a light flickering gently above. We took the elevator to our floor, its smooth movement making me aware of my feet aching from my high heels. When the elevator stopped on the 30th floor, we turned left toward our apartment, but something stopped us in the hallway. A female figure was wandering the corridor. Her dark hair was disheveled and dirty, covering part of her face. She wore what appeared to be a once elegant white dress, now tattered and stained with something dark. And from what I could tell, she was barefoot. Initially, we thought she might be an intoxicated resident trying to locate a friend's apartment after the celebrations. However, her appearance was strange, and we didn't recognize her. Our familiarity with the few neighbors made the situation even more disconcerting. I glanced at my husband. He seemed to reflect the same doubt. "Should we offer help?" I whispered. He hesitated. "Maybe she's just trying to find her way." The woman continued to move slowly down the hallway, dragging herself along the walls, and occasionally stopping to peer through peepholes in an odd, mechanical manner. There was something deeply unsettling about her movements. They were too jerky, too deliberate to belong to someone merely intoxicated. An eerie feeling crept over me. The strange idea that she didn't belong here, not just in our building, but somehow in our reality. She murmured something that sounded like a song, but the harsh tone resembled more of a growl. We stood motionless, absorbing that atmosphere of inexplicable tension. After traversing almost the entire corridor, she stopped in front of the door of a dear neighbor, an elderly lady I'll call Mrs. Jensen. Mrs. Jensen was neglected by her family, who rarely visited. Despite this, She frequently gifted us with homemade apple pies and sourdough bread, and I, in turn, helped her with groceries and medications. It was common for her smoke alarm to go off, and I would rush to help her disable it, often due to burnt toast. Despite the occasional inconvenience, our interactions almost always ended in pleasant moments, like taking a break for tea. I cared deeply for her and worried about her well-being. When I saw that bizarre figure observing through Mrs. Jensen's peephole, I couldn't stay silent. "Excuse me, are you all right?" My voice trembled as I spoke. The woman reacted with a slight spasm, hunching even more as if she was about to vomit or had been startled by my approach. My husband and I took a few steps toward her, but then she let out a faint laugh, almost inaudible but deeply disturbing. That's when fear began to dominate me, and I instinctively grabbed my phone. There was no way for us to reach our apartment without passing her, as our door was at the end of the corridor. My husband tried again. "Hey, did you hear us? Do you need help?" This time, her laughter grew, transforming into something between insane cackling and a savage growl. Slowly, she straightened up, though still trembling, and began to move toward the staircase near our apartment. I presumed she was trying to leave, perhaps embarrassed about being seen in such a state. I still imagined she was just a woman drunk in an embarrassing situation. However, if she was really that intoxicated, descending stairs from the 30th floor wouldn't be safe at all. Even so, the last thing I wanted was to get more involved. All I wanted was to get home and throw myself into bed. We tried to advance a few steps, but suddenly the woman stopped abruptly. She stood completely erect, turned her attention to our door, and began pounding on it with force, screaming as if something or someone was attacking her. A chill ran through my body, and I immediately dialed 911. The sound of her fists hitting against the wood was deafening, and her screams cut through the silence of the corridor. Curiously, no neighbor came out to check what was happening, although it was hard to believe they couldn't hear it. Perhaps they were as terrified as we were, peering from behind their doors. My husband intervened, trying to maintain control. "Hey, what are you doing? Stop now." Suddenly, she ceased the blows and fell to the floor in a frighteningly rapid movement. She began crawling in our direction. When she raised her face, all I could perceive were dark, sunken eyes. Her mouth appeared dirty, stained black, and the sound she made was a grotesque growl, as if something was stuck in her throat. I was paralyzed with terror. That's when she let out a long, threatening hiss, the kind you only hear in movies, something completely surreal in real life. Terrified, I kicked off my shoes, and my husband and I ran for the staircase at the opposite end of the building. The elevator was far too dangerous an option. We needed to escape as quickly as possible. We descended 3 flights of stairs before stopping to listen if she was coming after us. However, with my heart racing, it was almost impossible to distinguish any sound. We hid there for about 20 minutes, trying to gather courage to return. When we finally went back up, the corridor was empty. The woman had disappeared. We entered our apartment with relief, thankful to finally be safe. My husband sent a message to the building manager, who promised to speak with us the following morning. Even being at home, I felt restless. The image of that woman, her disturbing laughter, and the sounds she made continued to echo in my mind. It was impossible to relax despite being completely exhausted. I could hardly sleep that night. The next day, my husband spoke with the building manager and asked to review the security camera footage. However, there was absolutely nothing recorded. The manager explained that the cameras had malfunctioned due to an electrical surge during the fireworks display the night before. To this day, this doesn't make sense to me. That woman clearly faced some kind of problem, but was she a real danger? A year later, we decided to move. Still, with each Independence Day, I can't help but remember that strange night. What troubles me most is what my husband confided in me months later. He admitted that as the woman was crawling toward us, for just a brief second, he thought he recognized her as a perfect doppelganger of Mrs. Jensen, but decades younger, and with an expression of pure malice that our kind neighbor could never possess. I'm still not sure if this was just his mind playing tricks on him in that moment of terror, or if there was something far more sinister at work in our building that night. I've researched local history since then and discovered that 50 years earlier, a young woman matching our intruder's description had jumped to her death from what would now be Mrs. Jensen's balcony after learning her fiancé had perished in Vietnam. Sometimes I wonder if what we encountered was merely a troubled woman having a mental health crisis, or something that only returns on nights when the veil between worlds grows thin. My name is Rachel, and my closest friend is Samuel. What I'm about to tell you happened several years ago during my time in Boston. Back then, Samuel was in a relationship with someone who unfortunately lost their life in a tragic motorcycle accident while traveling through the mountains of New Hampshire. Due to various circumstances happening in my own life at that time, a family emergency that required me to stay on the West Coast, I couldn't physically attend the memorial service or burial. My only way to support Samuel was through a phone call I made the night of the wake. It was close to midnight when we spoke. I expected to find Samuel completely devastated, crying intensely, or at least showing more explicit grief. Not because I wanted to see him suffer, but because losing someone so suddenly is something difficult to process. However, the conversation was marked by an unexpectedly restrained tone. A simple "Hey, how are you?" followed by my condolences and his responses like, "Yes, I need to come to terms with it." Suddenly, silence took over the call. Then, from the other end of the line, I heard the sound of Samuel crying. He was sobbing deeply, and the sadness in his voice was unmistakable. "Samuel, I'm here for whatever you need." "I'm truly sorry," I said softly. As he continued crying, I found myself thinking about how to comfort him, what words to use. It's complicated to offer support by phone without being able to hug him or hold his hand. But before I could say anything else, Samuel spoke. "Hey, take it easy. I know you cared about him too, but please don't cry. I haven't been crying these past few days because I know he wouldn't want to see us like this." I was confused. I replied that I wasn't crying, and that actually I had heard him crying. The call plunged into a strange silence. Samuel seemed serene, his voice calm as if he had never been crying. Neither of us could understand what had happened. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the call in my mind, wondering if perhaps what I'd heard was some kind of farewell. Could it have been his partner, somehow communicating through Samuel? The thought sent shivers down my spine. 3 days later, Samuel called me again. His voice was different, steadier, but with an edge I hadn't heard before. "Rachel," he said, "something strange happened at the cemetery yesterday." The caretaker approached me and said he'd seen someone sitting by the grave the night before. When he described the person, it was him, Rachel. It matched him exactly. I didn't know what to believe anymore. The rational part of my mind searched for logical explanations. Grief playing tricks on us. Coincidences. The caretaker mistaking someone else for Samuel's partner. But then I remembered that sound of crying during our call. Crying that Samuel himself wasn't aware of. And I wondered if there are some things in this world that simply defy explanation. Three years before the pandemic changed everyone's routine, I decided to spend a warm autumn afternoon at a secluded beach along Lake Michigan with my sister, my uncle, and my cousin. My father always had a passion for collecting little treasures from nature, smooth stones, pieces of driftwood, and anything unusual that the waters had polished and transformed over time. So we set out with a plan to walk along the shoreline as the sun began its descent, gathering interesting rocks, beach glass, and whatever else might catch our eye as a thoughtful gift for him. I remember clearly that a local dog, a scruffy, sand-colored mutt, often accompanied beachgoers there. The locals called him Scout, and he was beloved by regular visitors, almost always appearing to play or accept treats that people offered. That crisp September evening was no exception. Scout came bounding toward us, tail wagging enthusiastically, and joined our little expedition without hesitation. At that moment, the beach seemed nearly deserted except for the four of us and Scout. Few people ventured onto the cool sand as the afternoon light began to soften and the temperature started to drop. After walking for about 20 minutes, I spotted a figure in the distance. An elderly man seated in what looked like an old wooden chair, half submerged in the shallow water, holding a fishing rod. He appeared completely absorbed in his activity, barely moving at all, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun was beginning to meet the water, as if he were waiting eternally for a fish that would never bite. As we approached, Scout, who had been contentedly trotting alongside us, suddenly transformed. He began growling and barking in a way I had never witnessed before, his hackles raised, teeth bared, and a deep rumbling sound emerging from his chest. My cousin and I tried to calm him down, stroking his head and speaking in soothing tones. But the dog remained agitated, clearly disturbed by the presence of this stranger. The fisherman, however, showed no reaction to Scout's aggressive display, nor did he acknowledge our approach. He remained perfectly still, ignoring everything around him, as if existing in a completely different realm from ours. The stillness with which he sat was unnatural. Not even the slight movements you'd expect from a person breathing deeply or shifting their weight. An intense feeling of unease swept over me. There was something profoundly wrong about this man, as if he didn't belong in our reality, like a glitch in the fabric of our world. His presence felt like a cold spot in an otherwise warm room. We decided to continue walking, hoping that Scout would settle down as we created distance between us and the mysterious figure. And indeed, after about 30 yards, Scout's demeanor gradually returned to normal. He resumed running playfully along the shoreline, occasionally splashing in the shallow water. Yet all of us remained disturbed by what had just happened. We briefly discussed how strange Scout's reaction had been, as none of us had ever seen the friendly dog act so hostile toward anyone before. Just a few minutes later, my cousin, who was walking a few steps behind me, suddenly grabbed my elbow, stopping me in my tracks. "Look back there," he whispered, his voice tight with confusion. When I turned around, I experienced a shock that still resonates with me today. The fisherman and his chair had completely vanished. I scanned the shoreline in every direction, searching for any sign of movement, any indication that someone had been there moments ago, footprints in the sand, the impression of a chair, abandoned fishing equipment. But there was nothing. Just smooth, untouched sand where the man had been sitting. I asked my sister if she had seen the old man gather his things and leave, but she appeared just as puzzled as I was. She had been watching the water and hadn't noticed anything unusual. My uncle, the most pragmatic among us, began formulating theories. Perhaps the man had waded deeper into the water for some reason, or maybe he had quickly packed up and left while we weren't paying attention. But none of these explanations seemed plausible. The beach stretched for nearly a mile in both directions, with no obstructions or hiding places. We would have easily spotted someone walking away, especially someone carrying a chair and fishing equipment. And the water was too cold for swimming. No one would willingly wade deeper into Lake Michigan as evening approached in early fall. The air seemed to grow significantly colder in that moment, and I felt a distinct chill crawling up my spine that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. It was as if the silence and the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore were amplifying the strangeness of what we had just experienced. My family members shared similar feelings. We had all clearly seen someone there, and within moments, all traces of his existence had simply evaporated. We unanimously decided it was time to head back. The sun was nearly gone now anyway, and none of us felt comfortable continuing our walk after what had happened. During the drive home, we couldn't stop discussing the incident, proposing and rejecting various explanations. Could it have been some kind of shared hallucination? An optical illusion created by the fading light? Someone with remarkable skills at camouflage and silent movement? Or was it something that defied conventional explanation altogether? Later that evening, while having dinner at a local restaurant, I casually mentioned our strange encounter to our waitress, who had mentioned she'd grown up in the area. Her face changed immediately, losing its friendly expression. She told us that decades ago, an old fisherman had drowned near that exact spot after falling asleep in his chair during high tide. According to local legend, his spirit still appears occasionally, always in the same position, eternally fishing for something he'll never catch. "The dogs always know," she added quietly. "They say animals can sense these things better than we can." To this day, my family and I have never reached a definitive conclusion about what we witnessed. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was nothing more than an elaborate prank, or a misunderstanding caused by poor visibility in the fading light. But then I remember Scout's reaction, the immediate, visceral fear in an otherwise friendly dog. and I know something truly inexplicable happened that day. Even now, years later, when I recall this story, I feel the same eerie sensation wash over me. The dog's unusual aggression, the man's distant, empty gaze, and his impossible disappearance without a trace are details that remain vivid in my memory, as clear as the sound of the waves on the shore of Lake Michigan that strange autumn evening. My name is Valerie, and I'm from New Mexico. What I'm about to share happened a few years ago, when I was studying culinary arts at a local institute. During that time, a group of classmates and I decided to spend the day at a hot spring located in the eastern part of the state. Some suggested we take a drive to a small village across the border, but since it was too far, we ended up sticking with our initial plan and headed for the hot springs instead. The plan was simple, but exciting nonetheless. Enjoy the day and celebrate both my friend's birthday and my own. Without going into too many details, we had a wonderful day. We ate, talked, listened to music, laughed, and even swam in the natural pools. As twilight began to descend, a few friends left the resort area to get more supplies, drinks, snacks, and other things for the evening. Time passed, and they were taking longer than expected to return. That's when one of the girls, the wife of one of the guys who had left, came to me visibly uneasy. She told me she had seen her husband waving to her from near some sagebrush at the edge of the resort property. But something didn't seem right. According to her, the gesture he was making was unusual, as if he was insistently beckoning her to approach, which wasn't like him at all. Worried, she decided to find me. We went together to the spot where she claimed to have seen him. There he was, or at least it appeared to be him, at the edge of the desert behind the brush, gesturing for us to come closer. She called out for him to come to us instead, but he only shook his head and continued motioning with his hand. "Don't approach him," I whispered to her. I asked her to pay attention to his clothes. That's when she realized the clothes weren't the same ones he was wearing when he left to get supplies. In that moment, we felt a chill run down our spines. The face was her husband's, but something was profoundly wrong. We tried to stay calm and backed away, returning to the group. Once there, she called her husband's cell phone. He answered quickly and apologized for the delay, explaining that they had found several stores closed and encountered some setbacks along the way. She insisted, asking if he had returned to the resort earlier, but he categorically denied it. Shortly after, within minutes, the group arrived back. We reported what had happened, and the atmosphere grew tense. We considered investigating, but didn't think it would be safe. It was at that moment that a security guard appeared. After hearing our account, he advised us not to go near that area. He explained that beyond the sagebrush lay an abandoned mineshaft, and that it was common for strange individuals to conduct rituals or mysterious practices in that region. The guard mentioned that unusual things happened there, and that it was best to avoid the area since there were reports of people disappearing after being lured in a similar manner. What made it even more disturbing was when he told us that just last month, they found abandoned cameras and equipment from a documentary crew that had been investigating local legends about skinwalkers, beings that could take on the appearance of loved ones. The crew was never found. In the end, we were thankful we had followed our instincts. and felt relieved we hadn't approached whatever or whoever was out there. That night, none of us slept well, and to this day, I still get goosebumps thinking about what might have happened if we had followed that thing that looked so much like her husband, but clearly wasn't. The resort closed down the following year. They never gave an official reason, but the locals say the disappearances never stopped. My name is Michael Lawson, and I live in Elmwood Heights on the east side of Chicago. What I'm about to tell you happened to me and my wife Sarah last summer. We were vacationing in Key West, Florida, and decided to explore one of the secluded beaches off the tourist path. As was my custom, I checked the water depth to ensure it would be safe for Sarah to swim, as she's always been a bit nervous in deep water. Everything seemed perfectly safe, so we began swimming peacefully. A few minutes later, we drifted slightly apart from each other. Suddenly, I heard Sarah scream for help, her voice filled with terror. I immediately swam to her, wrapped my arms around her, and heard her gasping, "Let's get out of the water now." There was no time for explanations. Only when we reached the shore and calmed down did she tell me what had happened. While swimming peacefully, she felt something touch her foot. It could have been a fish or seaweed, but she described having the immediate certainty that it was something different. The situation worsened when she realized that a hand was gripping her ankle, trying to pull her down. She fought against it, but when she looked down, she saw nothing and no one. Still, she was certain it was a hand. That's when she screamed for help. We were alone on that isolated beach. I had heard stories about the souls of drowned people trying to pull others down to the depths, but I never mentioned this to Sarah. She already fears deep water, and talking about it would certainly make her refuse to swim ever again. I also want to share another curious episode that happened in our current home. Sarah and I have 4 children, 3 daughters and 1 son, all adults now. Several years ago, we moved into a modest but cozy apartment in a newly built complex. One evening, we organized a family gathering, though the exact reason escapes me now. Present were my daughters and their husbands, plus my son who was still living with us at the time. After dinner, we were chatting around the table with several bottles of soda placed on it. Suddenly, one of the bottles began to move. We all froze, watching in silence as the bottle slid about 8 inches across the table. My son-in-law, whom we called Drew, grabbed the bottle and asked, "Are you guys playing a joke? Did you tie a string to this?" He examined the bottle from all angles, looking for some trick, but found nothing. I denied playing any pranks and joked that it might be the dead one. At that very moment, another bottle began to slide in the same manner, right before our eyes. I confess I didn't feel afraid, perhaps because it was around 4 in the afternoon, and sunlight still illuminated everything. The moment was more intriguing than frightening. After that, we didn't exchange another word. We simply got up from the table in silence and placed the bottles on the floor. Later that evening, everyone left. Sarah went to our bedroom, while I stayed in the living room watching television. Suddenly she appeared and said, "Sorry, but I didn't understand what you just said." I found this strange and replied that I hadn't spoken at all, that I had been sitting watching TV for quite some time. She insisted, looking concerned, that I had whispered something in her ear. Since she was busy at that moment, she hadn't asked immediately, and had now come to find out what it was about. As she was explaining, her face suddenly changed. It became consumed with absolute terror, making no sound, just pointing at something behind me, her eyes wide open and mouth agape. In that instant, an icy chill ran down my spine. I immediately stood up to embrace her, not daring to look behind me. She began to cry, trembling with fear. I felt more anger than dread at that moment. I shouted throughout the house, cursing and ordering whatever was there to leave us in peace. Despite my own fear, the helplessness of seeing her in that state was greater. When she finally calmed down, she told me what she had seen. Upon entering the living room to speak to me, she noticed a black shadow behind me with arms extended as if about to embrace me. Additionally, beside the sofa, another shadowy figure was peering out, tilting its head forward and staring directly at her. This vision had left her paralyzed with terror. We stayed together in the kitchen, waiting for our son Jason, who had gone out with friends. When he arrived, we told him everything, but skeptical as always. He didn't believe us and went straight to bed. The next day, Jason's fiancée, Rebecca, came to visit him. I had left in the morning and returned at noon to have lunch with the family. When I arrived, I found Rebecca crying outside the house with Jason sitting beside her, looking worried. I quickly approached and asked what had happened. He replied with obvious guilt that he had slapped her in a moment of frustration. I immediately shouted at him, making it clear that this was unacceptable behavior. However, he suggested I ask Rebecca for the reason. When I questioned her, Rebecca, still sobbing, said she preferred Jason to explain, demanding to know once and for all what was happening. I asked my son to tell me everything. Reluctantly, he explained that they had gone upstairs to rest in his room. At some point, he went downstairs to get a glass of water, leaving Rebecca sleeping. While in the kitchen, he heard a desperate scream coming from the bedroom. He ran upstairs and found Rebecca sitting on the bed, crying and screaming, completely distraught. She didn't respond to anything he said or did. Not knowing how to help her, and in desperation, he slapped her to bring her back to her senses, though this didn't justify his action. Rebecca then explained that as soon as she realized Jason had left the room, she tried to move to pull the blanket over herself, but couldn't find it. She opened her eyes to look for it, and surprisingly, saw the blanket floating above her, completely stretched out, about 3 feet below the ceiling. The scene lasted only a few seconds, but was enough to terrify her. As soon as she began to scream, the blanket fell directly on top of her. When she finished relating the incident, none of us knew how to react. Jason decided to take her home that same day. That was the last time we saw Rebecca. After this episode, their relationship ended, and to this day, we don't know exactly why these things happened. The apartments where we live are new. We were even among the first residents. I conducted some investigations about the area and discovered something that might explain these events. The entire land where the condominium was built was previously a landfill. It was filled with soil that came from a decommissioned municipal cemetery. At the time of construction, some areas were still being filled, and many neighbors complained about the trucks bringing in the soil. It wasn't uncommon to find pieces of wood that appeared to be from old coffins, and on one occasion, human bones were even discovered. Despite the complaints, construction was already advanced, and everything was simply covered up and left that way forever. My family and I have experienced several other inexplicable occurrences in this place. I plan to share more of them soon. Have you ever lived in or known someone who lived in a place that was once a cemetery, used for clandestine burials, or something similar? It all began in late October, during that crisp autumn when the leaves were falling, and everything seemed to be changing. My parents had just finalized their divorce, and we found ourselves living with my mother in our old Victorian house on Maple Ridge. Since my father moved out, we had to adjust our sleeping arrangements. The master bedroom now accommodated a queen-sized bed and a twin bed. My younger sister shared the queen bed with my mother, while I slept alone in the twin bed without any issues. My little brother kept his own room adjacent to ours. During this time, my mother started working at a family diner on the outskirts of town. Her shift typically ran from 4 or 5 in the afternoon until around 10 or 11 at night. Throughout those hours, my siblings and I would be alone in the house. It's worth mentioning that although we spent many evenings by ourselves, we had never experienced anything unusual until one particular night. It was already busy October, with the approaching Halloween season bringing more customers to the diner, and my mother's hours were extended. On this specific evening, she didn't return home until around midnight or perhaps a little after. When she arrived, we started talking, just the two of us, since my siblings had gone to stay with our aunt and uncle for the night. After a late dinner, we continued our conversation. At some point, she mentioned she needed to use the bathroom in the master bedroom. I followed her and sat on the bed while she entered the bathroom. We kept talking, with me asking about her day. Suddenly, I heard my mother call my name from inside the bathroom. "Honey," I asked what was wrong. She called me again, more firmly this time. "Come here." I got up quickly, opened the bathroom door, and found her standing near the sink with her toothbrush in hand. I asked what was happening, and before she could answer, I swear, and I don't make oaths lightly, we both heard something from behind the shower curtain. It was the moaning of a man, sounds I can only describe as someone in profound agony. I stood frozen, speechless. My mother, realizing I heard it too, became equally paralyzed. The sound stopped as abruptly as it had begun. Neither of us had the courage to pull back the curtain to see what might be there. We were alone in the house. I had spent the entire day there, and no one had entered. With my siblings away, the house felt even emptier. This situation remains unexplained. The neighboring houses were too distant for the sound to have come from outside, and even if that were possible, it wouldn't make sense. That incident happened on a Sunday. The following Friday night, I was finishing a school project. It was already past 2 or 3 in the morning when I completed it. I turned everything off and went to the bedroom to sleep. My sister was awake, scrolling through her phone. I asked her to turn it off and go to sleep since it was late. I lay down, she did the same, and soon she fell asleep. A few minutes later, as I was drifting between being awake and falling asleep, I felt something like a pinch on my left cheek. At first, I thought it was my sister. She had this annoying habit of lightly touching my eyelids when she couldn't sleep, just so I would stay awake until she dozed off. She had never pinched me before, but in that moment, I assumed it might be her new way of keeping me awake. Still tired, I grumbled, "Stop it and let me sleep. It's already late." But the pinches continued, this time at various points on my left cheek. I admit I became very irritated, especially due to the accumulated stress from all the assignments I needed to submit that week. I raised my hand and swatted in an attempt to make her stop once and for all. I didn't open my eyes, but I felt that I hit something. Immediately afterward, everything stopped, and I finally managed to drift back to sleep. However, just minutes later, the pinches started again, now on my right cheek. That's when my patience reached its limit. Determined, I opened my eyes to complain and tell my sister to go back to her own bed. But the moment I did, I encountered something that sent chills down my spine. Thanks to the faint light coming through the window, I saw an extremely pale face very close to mine, staring at me intently and smiling. I couldn't distinguish the facial features because the room was dark, but the enormous, toothless grin stood out starkly against the paleness of that face. This lasted only 1 or 2 seconds, because then I saw the face, along with the shadowy figure supporting it, quickly drag itself under my bed. Even overwhelmed with fear, I still wanted to believe it was my sister trying to play a prank on me. I turned my face toward the queen bed, but there she was, sound asleep next to my mother. I covered myself completely with the sheet and recited every prayer I knew until somehow sleep overcame me. I never found an explanation for what happened that night. Other strange things have also occurred to me, my mother, and my siblings, but those are stories for another time. The strangest part: when I looked under the bed the next morning, I found a single child's tooth, yellowed with age, that none of us recognized. Sometimes at night, I still feel those pinches, and occasionally, when I'm alone in the bathroom, I hear faint whispers coming from behind the shower curtain. I never pull it back anymore. Some things are better left unseen in the shadows of Maple Ridge. Though brief, this experience marked me deeply when it happened, because I was only 9 years old at the time. It might seem trivial to anyone hearing it now, but in those days, what I experienced deprived me of many nights of sleep. It was winter in rural Vermont, and our family had just moved into an old colonial house that dated back to the late 1800s. One particularly cold night, somewhere around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up to a peculiar sound that filled my entire bedroom. I still can't describe exactly what it was like. Perhaps that's why it terrified me so much. The noise seemed to travel throughout the entire space, moving close to my bed, going from the door to the antique wardrobe, and even shifting underneath where I slept. Even though I sat up completely alert, my eyes couldn't capture anything in the shadowy darkness of the room. The moonlight cast strange patterns through the frost-covered windows, making everything seem distorted and unfamiliar. That's when I noticed something in the darkest corner, a small, completely black silhouette. In the blink of an eye, it moved rapidly in my direction. I felt my heart racing, and instinctively pulled my thick quilt over my head as if it were some kind of shield. Suddenly, the sound stopped. Gradually, I tried to convince myself that it could have just been my imagination, even though deep down I knew it wasn't. But the silence was brief, The noise began echoing through the room again, and panic returned. It was then that an idea came to mind. I remembered a remote-controlled train, set my grandfather had given me several weeks before during the holidays. My older brother wasn't home that night. He was staying at a friend's house across town. But I thought perhaps the remote had gotten stuck somewhere, causing the train to move erratically on its own. This thought calmed me enough to eventually fall back asleep, though my dreams were filled with shadows and whispers. The next morning, as soon as I woke up, my memory returned to what had happened. I decided to investigate. I started by looking under the bed, and there I found the remote control. I picked it up, expecting it to be pressed down or stuck on something, but it wasn't. What's more, I noticed the remote had no batteries in it. I then went looking for the train set, which was near the wardrobe. I picked up the toy and discovered it also had no batteries whatsoever. What made it even more disturbing was finding tiny, unidentifiable tracks in the thin layer of dust that had settled on my bedroom floor, tracks that couldn't have been made by the train without power. To this day, I've never discovered what really happened that night, and I've preferred not to deepen my investigation. The only hypothesis left to me is to imagine that something or someone was playing with that remote control without any power source, right under my bed. Sometimes, on particularly quiet nights in my adult life, I still hear what sounds like the faint mechanical whirring of a toy train, and I wonder if whatever visited me that winter night has been following me ever since. When I first moved to Pinewood Heights, I was ecstatic. The tree-lined streets with their Victorian-era houses, manicured lawns, and friendly faces created the sense of a perfect place for a fresh start. It was summer of 1987, and I had just landed my dream job at the local radio station. My small cottage at the end of Maple Lane was cozy and charming, and I quickly settled into a comfortable routine. The neighbors were welcoming, especially the man who lived next door. He introduced himself as Raymond, a middle-aged gentleman with a warm smile and seemingly genuine interest in helping me settle into the neighborhood. At first, I appreciated Raymond's friendliness. He offered to help with yard work, invited me over for barbecues, and gave advice about local services. It was nice having someone willing to help, especially when you're new to a place. We would occasionally chat over the fence, and he always seemed interested in learning more about me. Where I worked, my hobbies, even about my family background. I found his curiosity a bit excessive, but dismissed it as harmless, neighborly interest. However, over time, Raymond's behavior began to shift from friendly to disturbing. He started asking increasingly personal questions. He wanted to know details of my work schedule, the names of my friends, and even why I wasn't dating anyone. His questions were intrusive, and I began feeling uncomfortable with how much he wanted to know about my life. There was something about the way he asked, an intensity in his gaze that made me feel uneasy. I tried to distance myself, making excuses when he invited me over or attempted to engage in lengthy conversations. But Raymond was persistent. He always seemed to be outside when I left for work or returned home, waving and calling out to me as if he'd been watching for my comings and goings. The feeling that he was always there, always watching, became harder to shake. Then one day, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was on a Sunday morning, as I was tidying up my front yard, rearranging some flower pots that sat on the steps. As I bent down to move one of the pots, something metallic caught my eye. Hidden among the leaves was a small black object. I picked it up, and my heart froze when I realized what it was: a miniature camera. A small, unobtrusive device, perfectly positioned to capture everything happening at my front door. My body trembled as I held the camera, a sense of violation washing over me. Someone had been watching me, recording my every move as I entered and left my home. The feeling of security I once had in my space was shattered instantly. I didn't want to believe it, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Raymond's strange behavior, his obsession with my routines, it all pointed to him. But why? What did he hope to gain by violating my privacy like this? Questions swirled in my head, each becoming more disturbing than the last. Taking a deep breath, I decided I couldn't ignore this. I needed answers. I walked over to Raymond's house, holding the camera in my hand, and knocked on his door. When he opened it, his expression shifted from surprise to something else, something I couldn't quite place. "I found this," I said, holding up the camera. It was hidden behind a flower pot in my yard. "Care to explain?" For a moment, Raymond's face went blank, as if he was processing the situation, and then he let out a nervous laugh. "Oh, that's just for security. Can't be too careful these days, right?" I stared at him, unfathomable outrage and anger boiling inside me. "Security? You've been spying on me. This isn't normal, Raymond. This is unacceptable." Raymond's smile faded, and his eyes became pleading. "I didn't mean to upset you. I was just trying to look out for you. You're new here, and I thought it would be good to keep an eye on things, in case something happened." His words did little to appease my indignation. If anything, they only made me feel more uncomfortable. This wasn't about security, it was about control. He wanted to know everything about me, monitor my every move, and I couldn't tolerate it. "I don't like this," I said firmly. "You had no right to place a camera on my property without my consent. I want you to remove any other cameras you might have installed and leave me alone. Do you understand?" Raymond's face darkened, and for a moment I saw a flash of something cold in his eyes, but then he nodded, and his expression became friendly again, almost apologetic. "Of course, sorry, I'll remove the camera. It won't happen again." I didn't trust him. Something about his quick change in demeanor seemed fake, as if he was just saying what I wanted to hear. But I had made my point, and I hoped that would be the end of it. The next few days, I kept a close eye on my surroundings, wary of any sign that Raymond was still watching me. I checked my yard, windows, and even the inside of my house for more cameras, but found nothing suspicious. For a while, everything seemed to go back to normal. Raymond kept his distance, only giving a polite nod when our paths crossed, and I started to think that perhaps he had genuinely understood that his behavior was inappropriate. Little did I know that this was just the beginning of a much darker turn of events. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, my landline phone rang. I picked it up, expecting it to be my sister, who often called around this time. But when I answered, there was only silence. "Hello," I repeated, thinking it might be a bad connection. Still nothing, just the faint sound of breathing on the other end. After a few seconds, I hung up, assuming it was a wrong number or perhaps someone playing a prank. But the calls continued. Every night around the same time, the phone would ring. And when I answered, there would be nothing but that eerie silence followed by the sound of breathing. I started to let it ring, hoping whoever it was would give up, but they were persistent. The calls came like clockwork, and with each one, a growing sense of unease settled over me. I tried to trace the number, but it always showed up as unknown or private. I considered changing my number, but something held me back, a stubborn part of me that didn't want to be forced out of my own life by some anonymous caller. At work, I mentioned the calls to my colleague, Sarah. We were in the break room of the radio station, the hum of equipment providing a comforting background noise compared to the silence of my home. "That's creepy," she said, her eyes darkening with concern. "You should report it. It's not normal, especially if the number can't be traced." I agreed, but inside, I was already growing anxious that something much more serious was behind these calls. Her advice was sound, but I wasn't prepared for what would happen next. That night the call came again, and instead of the usual silence on the line, I heard it, slow breathing, as if someone was waiting. My fingers trembled as I pulled the phone away from my ear and looked at the receiver. Nothing, just the same unknown number. Each call became more oppressive. I felt increasingly isolated, as if every time my phone rang, I was being trapped in a cage I couldn't escape. I felt watched. In my cottage, in the stillness of the night, I constantly looked over my shoulder, searching for movements in the darkness that weren't there, hearing sounds that didn't exist, and each call intensified my sense of danger. I started checking the locks on the doors and windows every time I went to bed. I even left a small lamp on by my bedside to dispel some of the darkness, but it didn't help. Those calls continued, relentless and disturbing. A few days later, I told my friend Kate about it as we sat in a coffee shop. The bustle of the small town, a stark contrast to what I was feeling inside. "That's eerie," she said, her eyes darkening with worry. "You should have this checked out. It's not normal, especially if the number can't be traced." "I've already tried, but it led nowhere," I replied, staring into my cup. "And what if it's just a coincidence? What if it's just someone accidentally dialing my number?" "Don't be naive," she said. "This is something more than just coincidence." I felt my shoulders tense. She was right. What was happening was more than a simple misunderstanding. I couldn't stay in the dark anymore. The feeling of anxiety was growing stronger, and I realized that more action needed to be taken. I had to do something, but what? I considered changing my number. "I've thought about it," I admitted, stirring my coffee, abstractly staring at the cup. "But there's something stopping me. It's like I need to find out who's behind these calls. It's starting to get under my skin." Kate looked at me with concern. "You should be careful. This might just be a prank, but it could also be something more serious." I nodded, but I wasn't sure what to do. I couldn't just ignore these calls, not when they were beginning to feel so personal. A knot of worry was growing in my stomach, a feeling that something was very wrong. That night I sat on the edge of my bed, holding the phone in my hands, waiting. The clock struck midnight, and just when I was about to give up and go to sleep, it rang. My heart constricted when I saw the familiar unknown number on the display. I paused for a moment before answering. "Hello," I said, my voice trembling slightly. For several seconds there was nothing, just the usual silence. Then I heard it breathing, slow, steady, and frighteningly close. It sent chills down my spine, my body frozen as I tried to hear anything else. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to maintain composure. "Why are you calling?" The breathing continued, unchanged, as if my questions had no effect. I was about to hang up when I heard something else. A barely audible whisper, too quiet to make out. I brought the phone closer to my ear, my heart beating faster. "What did you say?" I whispered, fear and frustration mingling in my voice. There was a pause, and then the whisper repeated, now louder, clear enough for me to understand. It was my name, Jack. The voice was low, almost hissing, and it sounded so familiar, but I couldn't place from where. My blood ran cold, and I dropped the phone as if it had burned me. The call ended abruptly, the screen going dark as the phone landed on the bed. I sat frozen in place, trying to comprehend what had just happened. How did they know my name? I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if someone had invaded my life and taken something deeply personal. That night I didn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of wind outside made my nerves jangle. I left the lamp on, but the light did little to dispel the fear that had taken root in my mind. I tried to tell myself that it was just a cruel joke, that someone was playing with me, but deep in my heart, I knew it was more than just a prank. The next day, I went to the local police station. I told them about the calls, the strange noises, and the voice that whispered my name. The officer I spoke with was polite but skeptical. He suggested that it was probably just a prank or a crossed line, and advised me to block the number and change my phone number if it continued. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more than just a prank. I blocked the number as the officer advised, but part of me dreaded the silence that might follow. As disturbing as these calls were, the thought of not knowing who was behind them and why they were calling was far worse. That night my phone didn't ring. I sat in bed, watching the screen, half expecting it to light up again with that same unknown number, but it remained dark. I should have been relieved, but I was on edge, as if waiting for something to happen. As I was drifting off to sleep, my phone vibrated with a text message. My heart raced as I reached for it, fingers trembling. The message was from an unknown number, but this time, it wasn't the same number as before. The message was brief, just 2 words. "Miss me?" My breath caught. I stared at the screen. The message felt like a taunt, a reminder that whoever was behind the calls wasn't finished with me. I quickly blocked this number too, but it did little to alleviate my fear. The next few nights, I was constantly on alert, every sound making me jump, unable to relax. The calls had stopped, but the uncertainty remained, a constant presence in my mind. I began to wonder if I would ever feel safe again. A week passed without further contact, and I started to think that maybe it was over, that whoever had been terrorizing me had moved on. But the feeling of anxiety never fully left. I kept my phone nearby, waiting for the next call or message, knowing they could come at any moment. And then, just when I had begun to relax a little, my phone rang again. I looked at the screen, my stomach twisting into a knot. The number was unfamiliar, but different from the previous ones. I took a deep breath and answered. There was silence on the other end, and for a moment I thought it was just a dead line. But then I heard my name, whispered by that same familiar voice. Jack. I immediately hung up, my heart pounding. Whoever this was, they weren't done with me yet. That's when I realized that this wasn't just a random prank. Someone was watching me. Someone who knew my name, my habits, my life, and they weren't going to stop. The calls continued, each more terrifying than the last. I stopped answering, but they still came. Relentless and disturbing. The whispers became more frequent, and the breathing heavier, as if whoever was on the other end was getting closer. I changed my number, but it didn't help. The calls still found me. No matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted, that someone out there was waiting, watching. I couldn't stay in Pinewood Heights any longer. I packed my essentials and fled to my sister's place in another state, hoping that distance would break whatever connection this stalker had established. For a few weeks, there was blessed silence. No calls, no messages, just peace. I started to believe that perhaps it was tied to the house, to Raymond, and that by leaving, I had escaped. Then one night, as a thunderstorm raged outside my sister's apartment, my new phone rang. The number was unknown. My hands shook as I answered, hoping against hope that it was just a telemarketer or a wrong number. "Hello," I whispered. For a moment there was nothing, and relief began to wash over me. Then I heard it, that familiar breathing, followed by 3 words that sent ice through my veins. "Found you, Jack." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was clear, distinct, and unmistakably Raymond's. In that moment, I knew that no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, he would always find me. This wasn't about spying anymore. It was about possession. And the most terrifying part, I had no idea what he planned to do next. I don't know who they are or what they want, but I know one thing for certain. They won't stop until they get what they're after. And that's the scariest part of all this. The first message arrived on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting at my desk in the back corner of the open-plan startup office in Seattle, finishing up some code before our weekly progress meeting, when my phone vibrated against the wooden surface. I glanced at the screen and saw a message from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, assuming it was another spam text about an extended car warranty. But something made me pause. I opened it, expecting the usual nonsense, but what I read made my skin crawl. "That vintage band shirt looks great on you today. The faded red really brings out your eyes." I frowned, looking down at my worn Red Hot Chili Peppers concert tee. It wasn't an unusual choice of clothing for our casual tech workspace, and it could have been coincidence, but something about the message felt off. How could this person know what I was wearing? I scanned the office, trying to spot anyone acting suspicious, but everyone was absorbed in their screens or huddled in small discussion groups by the whiteboard wall. I dismissed it, thinking it must be some strange prank from a coworker, and went back to debugging my section of the app. But the messages didn't stop. Over the next several days, new texts arrived, each one increasingly disturbing. They described my habits, places I'd visited, and even conversations I'd had. One morning, as I was walking to work, I received a message that read, "Did you enjoy that pour-over at Emerald City Coffee? The barista with the septum piercing gave you an extra shot because she thinks you're cute." I stopped dead in my tracks on the rain-slicked sidewalk. I had indeed stopped at that coffee shop that morning, and the barista with the nose ring had given me a free extra shot, smiling in a way that seemed flirtatious. My heart raced as I reread the message. How could they possibly know this? I hadn't told anyone. At first, I tried to dismiss it as an elaborate prank. Maybe a friend who happened to be at the same coffee shop, or someone from the office keeping tabs on me. But over time, the messages became more specific, more intimately personal. They began predicting things that would happen to me, small accidents, minor mishaps that, while not life-threatening, were definitely unsettling. One evening in early October, as I was leaving my apartment building for a dinner date, I received a text. "Watch out for the broken pavement by the bus stop. In those new shoes, you might twist your ankle." I froze with my hand on the door handle of my building. There was indeed uneven pavement by the bus stop that I passed every day. But I'd never had any trouble with it before. And how did they know about my new shoes? I just bought them during my lunch break and hadn't shown them to anyone. I shook my head, telling myself I was being paranoid. But as I walked past the bus stop, distracted by thoughts of the text, my foot caught on a chunk of broken concrete that seemed more pronounced than I remembered. I stumbled, catching myself against a street lamp, heart pounding as the words from the text echoed in my mind. I decided to take action. I tried tracing the number, but every attempt led nowhere. It was as if the number didn't exist, a ghost in the system. I filed a report with the police, but without any explicit threat, they couldn't do much. They advised changing my number, but I hesitated. Part of me wanted to know who was behind this. The idea that someone was watching me, knowing so much about my life, terrified me. But I also needed answers. The messages continued to arrive, each one a reminder that someone was out there, watching me. "You're running late today, maybe skip coffee and take the earlier light rail train." The text accurately predicted delays, weather changes, and even the arrival of a package I wasn't expecting. My tech background made me consider all sorts of possibilities. Surveillance software on my phone, cameras in my apartment, even some kind of experimental AI that could somehow predict human behavior. I began to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. How could anyone know so much, predict these things with such accuracy? I started to withdraw, avoiding my usual routines, hoping to throw off whoever was watching me. I changed my route to work, stopped going to my favorite places, even began taking different paths home. But the texts followed me, commenting on my new routines, almost as if mocking my attempts to escape. "Nice try with the detour through Pioneer Square, but I still see you. The historical architecture is beautiful this time of year, isn't it?" Sleep became elusive. Every time my phone chimed, my heart would race, and I'd dread what I might read. The constant anxiety was exhausting, and I began to jump at shadows, seeing threats where there were none. I even thought about leaving the city for a while, heading to my parents' place in eastern Washington. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was sending these messages would find me wherever I went. Then, as suddenly as they began, the messages stopped. I noticed it one day when I realized I hadn't received any texts for more than 24 hours. At first, I felt relief, thinking that maybe it was finally over, but the relief quickly turned to anxiety. Why had they stopped? Had they moved on to someone else? Or was this part of some larger plan? Days turned into weeks, and still no messages. I began to relax, though the memory of those weeks of torment remained. Yet the silence became even worse than the texts themselves. I was constantly on edge, waiting for the next message, the next sign that someone was still watching me, but there was nothing. As weeks went by, I tried to return to normal life, but the knowledge that someone had known so much about me, predicted so many of my movements, weighed heavily on me. I became more cautious, more guarded, not just with my routines, but with the people around me. I installed security cameras in my apartment, routinely checked for tracking software on my devices, and even considered changing jobs to work remotely from a different city. This experience had shaken me to my core, leaving a scar that time couldn't fully heal. When friends asked why I seemed different, why I always preferred to meet in new places rather than our usual haunts, I brushed it off as wanting more variety in my life. How could I explain that I felt hunted in a city I once loved? One night, months after it had all ended, I sat alone in my apartment, the memories of the messages distant, but still present shadows in my mind. Outside, the November rain pattered against my windows, creating streaks of light from the street lamps below. My phone vibrated on the coffee table, and I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the screen, that familiar dread washing over me again. But when I picked up the phone, it was just a message from a friend, nothing more. I exhaled, trying to calm my racing heart, but as I set the phone down, one thought remained with me, chilling me to the bone. Somewhere out there, someone still knew too much about me. I was about to put my phone on silent when it vibrated once more, this time from an unknown number. My fingers trembled as I opened the message. "I've missed our conversations. Did you think I was gone for good? I was just watching you adjust, waiting for the right moment. By the way, that new security system you installed last week, it has a blind spot by your kitchen window. You might want to fix that before someone exploits it. Sweet dreams." The phone slipped from my hands and clattered to the floor. I stared at my kitchen window, curtains half drawn, and for just a moment, though it might have been my imagination, I thought I saw a shadow move across the fire escape outside. It was just a regular Friday night in New Orleans, the kind where the humid summer air clings to your skin as you stroll through the French Quarter with friends. We'd spent the evening at Mason Creole, our favorite spot for jambalaya and jazz, before heading to a hidden speakeasy down a cobblestone alley. The bartender, an older man with stories etched into the lines of his face, mixed drinks that tasted like liquid poetry, while saxophone notes floated through the dimly lit space. Laughter, stories about our college days, that easy camaraderie that comes from friendships spanning decades. It all made the night feel magical. One of those perfect evenings that leaves you smiling long after it ends. I remember checking my watch at 2 in the morning, surprised at how quickly time had passed, before we all hugged goodbye and scattered into Ubers, heading in different directions. But that happiness shattered the moment I reached for my wallet the next afternoon. and discovered it was gone. At first, I thought I just misplaced it in my post-nightcap haze. I retraced my steps throughout my Victorian apartment, checking every pocket, every corner, every possible place it might have fallen. I called both establishments, hoping someone had found it and turned it in, but no luck. As Sunday crawled by, the sinking feeling settled in my stomach that my wallet was gone for good, and I had no choice but to report the theft. I canceled my credit cards, filed a police report with an officer who seemed more interested in his coffee than my case, and began the tedious process of replacing my identification. It was frustrating, but what truly unsettled me was the thought that someone now had access to my personal information, someone who could use it however they pleased. 3 days later, as I was heading out to meet my editor, I work as a freelance photojournalist, I noticed a weathered leather journal wedged between my front door and the antique brass knocker. No markings, no return address, just a plain, worn journal with my name scrawled in a jagged hand across the cover. Puzzled, I took it down and opened it. Inside, nestled between the empty pages, was my wallet. For one brief moment, relief washed over me, until I opened it and saw that all its contents had been removed. My credit cards, ID, the $300 cash I'd withdrawn for the weekend, even the faded photograph of my grandfather I'd carried since childhood, all gone, replaced by a single sheet of paper hidden in one of the card compartments. I pulled it out and my heart stopped as I read the words written in bold, red ink. I know where the bodies are buried. A cold tremor ran up my spine, and my hand shook as I held the note. The words were simple yet filled with a threatening certainty that froze my blood. Someone had gone to the trouble of stealing my wallet, emptying its contents, and then returning it to me with this chilling message. Whoever it was knew where I lived, had been at my home, close enough to wedge the journal into my door without being noticed. Fear gripped me as I stared at the note, my mind racing with questions. Who did this? Why return the wallet? What bodies? What did they want? Despite all my efforts, I couldn't piece it together, couldn't make sense of what was happening. I only knew one thing. I was no longer safe in my own home. The next few days passed in a fog of paranoia and anxiety. I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched, that someone was lurking in the shadows of the century-old oak trees that lined my street, waiting for the right moment to strike. Every creak of the hardwood floors, every rustle of the Spanish moss outside my window made my heart race. I barely slept, jumping at every small sound, convinced someone was trying to break in. I decided to take action. The first thing I did was change the locks on the doors. The thought that someone might have a key to my apartment filled me with dread, so I called a locksmith immediately. I watched as he installed new deadbolts, checking twice to make sure everything was secure. But even this didn't entirely calm my fears. The next step was moving some of my belongings to my friend Marcus's place in the Garden District. I didn't have the time or ability to completely relocate, but I thought if I made it look like I wasn't living there consistently, it might deter whoever was watching me. I packed clothes, important documents, and everything of value, and spent several nights on Marcus's leather sectional. But the fear didn't leave me. I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched, even when I was miles from home. I also installed a security system with cameras, motion sensors, and an alarm that would alert both me and the local police station. The company assured me my apartment was now one of the most secure in the city, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease every time I walked through the door. I reviewed the camera footage obsessively, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever had left that note, but nothing appeared. It was as if this person had simply vanished, leaving me in a state of perpetual fear. Days turned into weeks, and gradually the intensity of my fears began to diminish, though they never completely disappeared. I started to restore some semblance of normal rhythm, though I remained extremely vigilant. I avoided going out late at night, kept the curtains drawn, and checked the locks multiple times before going to bed. But memories of that note haunted me, a reminder that someone had invaded my life in the most personal way. I became obsessed with finding who did this. I went over every detail of that evening with friends, trying to recall if anyone had been acting strangely, if I'd noticed anyone following us, but nothing stood out. I even considered the possibility that it was some sick practical joke. But the note didn't feel like a joke. It felt like a threat, one I couldn't ignore. One morning, about 5 weeks after finding the journal, I was sitting at my kitchen table editing photos when my phone rang. An unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something compelled me to pick up. "Hello," I said, hearing nothing but silence on the other end. After what felt like an eternity, a voice spoke, distorted, as if through some kind of modifier. "Check the cemetery on Prytania Street. Plot 17. Bring your camera." The line went dead before I could respond. My hands trembled as I set the phone down. Lafayette Cemetery on Prytania Street was one of the oldest in the city, famous for its above-ground tombs and winding paths. I'd photographed it countless times for travel magazines, capturing the haunting beauty of the stone angels and weathered crosses. I knew I should call the police, but what would I tell them? That I received a cryptic phone call about a cemetery. That weeks ago, someone returned my stolen wallet with a strange note. They'd think I was paranoid or seeking attention. And deep down, despite my fear, curiosity burned within me. What would I find at plot 17? That afternoon, heart-pounding, I made my way to the cemetery, camera in hand. The iron gates creaked as I pushed them open, stepping into the labyrinth of tombs and mausoleums. The air felt heavy with humidity and history as I navigated the narrow pathways, searching for plot 17. I found it tucked in a forgotten corner, a simple stone marker partially obscured by overgrown vines. As I brushed away the greenery, my blood ran cold. Carved into the stone was a familiar name, my own, and below it a fresh bouquet of black roses. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my camera. This couldn't be real. Someone was playing an elaborate, twisted game with me. As I raised my camera with shaking hands to document this macabre discovery, I noticed something tucked between the flowers, a small, weathered photograph. I picked it up carefully. It showed a group of 5 people standing in front of a lake house I didn't recognize. 4 faces I'd never seen before, and one I knew all too well, my own grandfather, decades younger than I'd ever known him. On the back, written in the same jagged handwriting as the note in my wallet, "Some secrets stay buried. Others come back to haunt us. Your grandfather knew this. Now you do too. Months have passed since that day at the cemetery, and although the fear no longer consumes me, it has left its mark. I've become more cautious, more attentive to what happens around me, and less trusting of others. The feeling of being watched never quite leaves me, sitting in my mind like a shadow. I've been researching my grandfather's past, discovering connections to people and places I never knew existed, piecing together a history that seems increasingly tangled with my present. I know I need to move forward, but part of me will always be looking over my shoulder, wondering if that anonymous threat will ever materialize, wondering what secrets my family has kept buried, wondering if I'll ever learn the whole truth. In the end, I still don't know who did this, but I'm beginning to understand why. While sorting through old memorabilia in the basement of my newly inherited Victorian home in coastal Maine, I heard the sound of someone moving upstairs. A soft creak of floorboards, a faint rustle of footsteps. My heart froze, and I became perfectly still, listening intently. The footsteps were deliberate, not like the random settling of an old house built in 1872, but the distinct gait of someone walking through the rooms. I quickly grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering to the operator that there was an intruder in my house. She instructed me to stay on the line and remain silent until the police arrived. I could still hear the footsteps above, moving from the kitchen to the living room, then toward the staircase. My mind raced as I concealed myself behind a stack of sea chests that once belonged to my great-uncle, a retired lighthouse keeper, praying that whoever was upstairs wouldn't descend into the basement. Minutes stretched like hours, the tension in the air so thick you could taste the salt and fear mixed together. Finally, I heard the sound of a vehicle approaching on the gravel driveway, followed by car doors slamming. The police had arrived. Relief washed over me, but strangely, the footsteps continued, seemingly oblivious to the arrival of law enforcement. I remained hidden until I heard officers calling out, announcing their presence. Only then did I emerge from the basement, my hands trembling as I climbed the worn wooden stairs to meet them. The officers methodically checked every room of the house, attic to cellar, but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been inside. They examined the windows and doors, just as I had done when I first arrived 3 weeks ago, and everything was secure. They even reviewed the footage from the surveillance cameras I had installed around the property after the first incident, but the video showed nothing. No one entering or exiting, no shadowy figures creeping through hallways, nothing disturbing the thick fog that had rolled in from the Atlantic that evening. It was as if the sounds I heard existed only in my imagination, but I knew better. I had heard those footsteps, felt the presence of someone or something moving through my ancestral home, the same home where my grandmother had once whispered about the others who walked these halls. The officers tried to reassure me, suggesting that it might simply be the house settling on its ancient foundation, or perhaps a raccoon or fox outside that I had mistaken for an intruder. But I saw the doubt in their eyes. They thought I was just overwhelmed, that perhaps I was too anxious about living alone in an unfamiliar place, with only the lighthouse beam sweeping across my windows every 37 seconds. After the police left, I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, telling myself that maybe they were right. Maybe I was just imagining things. But deep down, I knew better. Something was wrong with the house, something I couldn't explain. The alarm continued to go off, always at 3:17 in the morning, and each time it happened, I felt that same cold dread creeping up my spine like the tide coming in. After several nights, I decided to stay awake and watch the surveillance footage in real time, determined to figure out what was triggering the alarm. I sat in front of the monitor, the house dark and silent around me, the only light coming from the screen and the distant lighthouse beam that cut through my kitchen window every half minute. 3:17 came and went, and for a moment I thought perhaps the disturbances had ceased. But then the alarm shrieked, piercing through the silence like a foghorn in the dead of night. I quickly rewound the recording, my eyes scanning the screen for any signs of movement. There was nothing. No intruder, no animals, nothing that could have triggered the alarm. But listening more carefully, I heard something that made my heart stand still. Faint, almost imperceptible footsteps, muffled, distant, but undeniably human, or at least they had once been human. They were on the recording, but when I played it for others, the local sheriff who had known my family for generations, the tech specialist from the security company, even the town historian who was intrigued by my story, they heard nothing. It was as if these sounds were meant only for me, a descendant of the original lighthouse keeper who had built this house after 3 sailors were lost in the fog. The days that followed became a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. I became obsessed with the alarm and the footsteps, spending hours reviewing the recordings, trying to find even the slightest anomaly. But no matter what I did, the result was always the same, nothing visible, just those faint, ghostly footsteps echoing through the house, always followed by the smell of seawater and wet wool. I began to avoid going to sleep, dreading the moment when the alarm would trigger again. I lay awake, listening, waiting for the footsteps to begin. Sometimes I thought I could hear whispers, just at the edge of audibility, as if someone was trying to speak to me from the other side of the walls. But the words were always just beyond reach, leaving me with an ever-growing sense of unease, and the feeling that something was trying to show me something hidden beneath the floorboards of the main hallway. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag and left the house, staying with a friend in town while I tried to figure out what to do next. I couldn't live like this, constantly on edge, feeling watched, haunted by something I couldn't see, but that seemed to know exactly who I was and why I had returned to this coastal property after so many years away. I called in another technician, another police visit, but nothing helped. The alarm continued to malfunction. The footsteps continued to echo on the recordings, and I knew that whatever was in the house wasn't going to leave me in peace until I addressed what had happened in that house during the winter of 1913. The last night I spent in that house, the alarm went off at 3:17, as always, but this time when I listened to the recording, the footsteps were louder, clearer, as if they were right beside me. And this time I heard something else, a low, rough whisper, just 2 words, but it was enough to send me fleeing into the night, leaving behind the house and the secret buried beneath it. Find us. It wasn't until weeks later, when I finally gathered the courage to return with a local diver who specialized in recovering lost items from the sea, that we discovered what the spirits had been trying to tell me. Beneath the house, accessed through a forgotten trapdoor in the hallway, was a hidden chamber where 3 sailors had been imprisoned by my great uncle, the lighthouse keeper, who had deliberately extinguished the light on that foggy night so many years ago. Now I live in an apartment in the city, far from the coast and that house. But sometimes, at exactly 3:17 in the morning, my phone alarm goes off by itself. And each time, I hear those same footsteps, followed by those same 2 words, reminding me that some debts can never truly be settled, and some stories never truly end. My life at Horizon Publishing had fallen into a comfortable routine. I'd been editing manuscripts at the same small press for nearly 7 years, tucked away in the corner office of our converted Victorian building in downtown Portland. The rain-streaked windows, creaking hardwood floors, and my collection of antique fountain pens made my workspace feel more like a writer's sanctuary than a corporate desk. I had no reason to feel uneasy there until the notes began appearing. It was a foggy Tuesday morning in late autumn when I found the first one. I had just settled in with my thermos of chai tea and was reaching for my red editing pen when I noticed something unusual tucked between the pages of the manuscript I was working on. I carefully extracted a small folded piece of parchment paper with my name written in elegant calligraphy. At first, I thought it might be an invitation to one of those literary events our publishing house occasionally hosted. But as I unfolded the note, a chill ran down my spine. The message was brief but unsettling. "I know what haunts you at 3 in the morning." My mind began racing. What could this mean? I'd been struggling with insomnia for months, often waking at exactly 3 a.m., but I'd never mentioned this to anyone at work. I laughed nervously, dismissing it as a strange coincidence, or perhaps a misguided attempt at a literary joke from one of our more eccentric authors. I crumpled the note and tossed it into my recycling bin, determined to forget about it. But the notes continued to appear. Every few days, I'd discover a new one waiting for me. They materialized in impossible places, sealed inside advance reader copies that hadn't been opened yet, pressed between the glass and frame of my diploma. Or once, terrifyingly, as a bookmark in the novel I'd been reading at home the night before and had brought to work that morning. Each note was more personal, containing details no one should have known, childhood memories I'd never shared, private thoughts I'd only expressed in my journal, even specific nightmares that had plagued me recently. The handwriting was always the same, flowing, slightly tilted, and completely unfamiliar to me. The messages grew increasingly disturbing, hinting at my deepest insecurities, my most profound fears, and always ending with cryptic, chilling phrases like, "I'm woven into the fabric of your life," or "the pages of your story are mine to turn." By the 5th note, I was becoming paranoid. I found myself scanning the office, watching for anyone who might be observing me or slipping away from my desk, but nothing seemed out of place. Everyone continued with their daily tasks, oblivious to my growing anxiety. Inside, I was unraveling. The historic building, once charming with its creaking floors and hidden nooks, now felt like a labyrinth of watching eyes and listening ears. I confided in my colleague Marco, the senior fiction editor whose office adjoined mine through an old servant's passage. I hoped he might offer some logical explanation or advice. He listened attentively, his expression growing serious behind his vintage tortoiseshell glasses. "Are you certain this isn't research for one of our psychological thrillers?" he asked, trying to inject some levity. But the concern in his eyes betrayed his true feelings. "Perhaps you should speak with Eliza in HR," he suggested. And so I did. I approached HR, feeling somewhat foolish, but desperate to regain control of the situation. Eliza, our head of human resources, a formidable woman with silver-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun, listened to my concerns with an impassive expression. She assured me they would investigate the matter thoroughly, and asked if I had any suspicions about who might be behind this. But I was at a loss. I had no enemies at horizon, no one who would go to such lengths to fright me. Days passed after my conversation with HR, and I received no updates or explanations. I began to feel disconnected from reality. Each time I opened a manuscript or picked up a book, my heart would race, anticipating another note. But for a while there were none. Just as I was beginning to convince myself that it was over, that perhaps HR had quietly resolved the issue, the notes returned. This time they were worse. The messages were no longer merely mysterious. They had become explicitly threatening. One note simply read, "I know when your light goes out at night," and another, "The lock on your back door is surprisingly easy to pick." The final blow came on a Thursday evening during a thunderstorm that had knocked out power to half the building. It had been a long, tense week, and I was exhausted. As I sat at my desk, trying to focus on editing by the light of an old brass lamp running on a generator, I pulled open my drawer to retrieve a flash drive and found another note. My breath caught as I read it. "I'm watching you breathe right now." Those words triggered a surge of fear, unlike anything I'd ever experienced. A sudden pressure constricted my chest, as if invisible hands were squeezing my lungs. My hands trembled as I clutched the note. My mind raced frantically. The office suddenly seemed suffocating, the air thick with dread. I felt a gaze upon me, heavy and persistent. My heart hammered against my ribs as I slowly turned, expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. But the dimly lit office appeared empty. The usual sounds of keyboards clicking and coffee machines brewing had given way to an eerie silence, punctuated only by the occasional rumble of thunder and the rhythmic tapping of rain against the windows. It was late, and most of my colleagues had already left for the day. The antique chandelier in the hallway cast elongated shadows across the walls, transforming familiar spaces into something sinister. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and began to move around my desk, carefully examining every corner of the office. I checked behind the vintage bookshelves, peered into the darkened conference room, even looked under desks, but I found no one. The feeling of being observed didn't subside, gnawing at the edges of my consciousness, but I couldn't locate its source. My rational mind insisted it was merely imagination, fueled by the paranoia these notes had cultivated. But a deeper, primal instinct told me otherwise. Unable to shake the fear, I gathered my belongings and hurried to leave the building. I didn't look back, afraid of what I might or might not see if I did. That weekend, I barely slept, haunted by the thought that someone out there knew me, knew my fears, and was playing an elaborate game with my sanity. When Monday arrived, I dreaded returning to work. When I arrived, my office was exactly as I had left it, or so it seemed. I hesitantly opened my drawer, my heart constricting in my chest. But there was no new note, no sign that anything had been disturbed. For a brief moment, I felt relief, until I noticed something else. The note from Thursday was gone. The one that had said, "I'm watching you breathe right now." I had left it in my drawer, but now it had vanished. Someone had taken it. A glacial horror settled in my stomach. Whoever was doing this was closer than I could have imagined. I returned to HR, demanding answers, but Eliza seemed more irritated than concerned. "We've checked the security cameras," she said curtly. "No one has been tampering with your things. Are you sure you haven't misplaced these notes yourself?" Her words stung, and I left her office feeling even more isolated. The notes stopped after that, but the fear remained. I could no longer concentrate on my work, always feeling on edge, always looking over my shoulder. I never discovered who was behind those notes, or how they knew such intimate details about my life. But the experience left a permanent mark, a persistent uncertainty I could never quite shake. 3 months later, I received a promotion to senior editor, which came with an unexpected benefit: a move to our new satellite office in a modern building across town. I accepted immediately, hoping the change of environment would help me leave the nightmare behind. On my first day at the new office, I found my sleek, minimalist desk bathed in natural light from floor-to-ceiling windows. No creaking floors or shadowy corners here. As I arranged my belongings, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. Maybe now I could finally move on. That feeling lasted until I opened my laptop. There, set as my desktop background, was a photograph I'd never seen before, a picture of me, asleep in my bed, taken just the night before. In the corner of the image, written in that now familiar elegant handwriting, "New surroundings won't change our story. I'll always be watching." Even now, years later in a different city, with a different career, I still catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me from the shadows. Sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if they're watching me still. And sometimes, in moments even darker, I wonder if they were ever really there at all. Renting an old Victorian beach house in Nantucket, for the summer felt like stepping into another world. The house, perched on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic, was exactly what I had dreamed of, a perfect escape from the chaos of my life in Boston. It had its own charm with weathered shingles, creaking wooden floors, and the scent of salt and hydrangeas wafting through the open windows. Days passed in a peaceful rhythm, each filled with long walks along the shoreline, quiet evenings with a good book, and the simple joys of solitude as the waves crashed against the rocks below. But as days turned into weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that there was something hidden beneath the surface of this idyllic retreat. Soon enough, I would discover what it was. I first noticed the door in the attic 3 days after moving in. I was organizing my art supplies there, arranging canvases and paints in the dim light that filtered through a small round window. The attic spanned the entire length of the house, with exposed beams and that distinctive smell of old wood and dust that seemed suspended in the air. It was a place that felt like it was keeping secrets, and soon I found one of them. The door was small, almost concealed in the shadows at the far end of the attic. It was made of heavy oak, with an antique brass handle that gleamed dully in the weak light. Intrigued, I tried to open it, but the handle wouldn't turn. The door was locked. When I asked the property manager about it the next day, her response was curt. "That room is off limits," she said, her New England accent more pronounced than usual, her voice leaving no room for argument. "It's not included in the rental agreement. Just leave it be." Her answer only intensified my curiosity. What could possibly be in that room? I couldn't stop thinking about it. Each time I climbed up to the attic to paint, my eyes would drift to the door, my mind running through countless possibilities. What could she be hiding? One evening, while cleaning up after dinner, I found a key. It was hidden beneath the liner of an old hutch drawer, as if someone had deliberately tucked it away there. The moment I saw it, I knew what it was for. The temptation was too strong to resist. My heart raced as I took the key and climbed the 2 flights of stairs to the attic. The old steps groaned under my feet, as if warning me to turn back. I hesitated before the door, the key cold in my hand. Part of me understood I should leave it alone and respect the property manager's wishes, but my curiosity won out. I inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The door opened with a soft click, revealing a room that was entirely different from the rest of the house. It was immaculately clean, in stark contrast to the dusty attic. The air was cool and still, as if the room had been sealed off from the world for many years. Everything was meticulously organized. A small writing desk with a chair, shelves filled with old leather-bound journals and trinkets, a large chest against the far wall. But what caught my attention were the recordings. They were everywhere. On the walls, on the shelves, even on the floor, dozens of them, all labeled with dates and times, neatly arranged in chronological order. And all of them had my name on them. A chill ran down my spine as I approached. My eyes scanned the labels, which were written in a neat, precise handwriting. Sarah walking on the beach, Sarah reading on the porch, Sarah painting in the attic. Some seemed recent, others appeared to have been recorded at the moment when. The more I looked, the more unsettled I felt. Who could have made these recordings? How had I not noticed someone watching me? My breathing quickened when I realized that some of the recordings were labeled as being from inside the house. There were entries for Sarah cooking in the kitchen, Sarah relaxing in the living room, even Sarah sleeping in the master bedroom. The thought made my skin crawl, almost as if the recorder had been hiding in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to capture me at my most vulnerable. I couldn't bear it anymore. I backed away, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands trembled as I locked it and hurried downstairs. The key felt heavy in my pocket as I hid it back in the drawer where I'd found it, as if returning it to its hiding place might somehow erase what I had seen that night. I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind against the windows made me jump. I kept waiting to hear footsteps in the hallway, the sound of someone moving through the house. But the night passed in silence, the house as quiet as ever. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that it was all a misunderstanding. Maybe the recordings were left by a previous tenant, someone with an unusual hobby. Perhaps the property manager didn't even know about them. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. When I finally gathered the courage to return to the attic, the door to the hidden room was just as I had left it. I stood there for a long time, my hand on the key, debating whether to go back inside. Part of me wanted to leave it, to pretend I had never found it. But I needed to know. I opened the door, and my breath caught in my throat. The room was exactly the same as before, except for one horrifying detail. The recordings had been replaced. The new ones were digital voice recorders, their red recording lights blinking steadily, and they were all labeled with yesterday's date. My heart pounded in my chest as I picked one up and pressed play. The sound that came out was crystal clear, my own voice, singing softly to myself as I painted in the attic, a habit I wasn't even aware I had. Another recorder captured the sound of my breathing as I slept. The recordings were intimate, invasive, capturing moments I thought were private. The realization hit me like a wave of ice water. Someone had been in this house with me all along. Someone who had observed my every move, my every private moment. I backed away, nearly tripping over the threshold as I fled from the room. The key slipped from my fingers and clattered loudly on the floor, but I didn't care. I rushed downstairs, my head spinning with fear. I had to get out of there. Within the hour, I was packing my things and loading them into my car, determined to put as many miles between myself and that house as possible. I didn't tell the property manager why I was leaving early, didn't even ask for a refund. All I knew was that I couldn't stay there another night. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone watching me from one of the windows. But the house remained still and silent, its secrets hidden behind its charming facade. It was only when I reached the main road that I noticed something on the passenger seat beside me. A small voice recorder I'd never seen before. With trembling fingers, I pressed play and heard the property manager's voice, clear as day. She found the room. We'll try again with the next one. I never found out who made those recordings or why they were there. But the memory of that room and the feeling of being watched stayed with me long after I left. I learned a valuable lesson. Sometimes doors are better left locked. I graduated from college in the winter of 2010. After 4 years of living in a dorm with 3 roommates, I was desperately craving my own space. For 2 years, I saved every cent from my job at an IT company to make this dream come true. The plan was simple: find a cozy 1-bedroom apartment in a historic Boston neighborhood, not far from the park where I loved to run every morning. 3 of my college friends were already living in this area, which seemed like the perfect coincidence. I'd be close to people I knew while still having my own space. The first subway station was a 5-minute walk away, as were the grocery store, coffee shop, and a small bookstore where I could spend hours flipping through science fiction novels. I had saved $15,000, had no debts, and even managed to buy a used Ford Focus that I paid for in full. Life seemed perfect. When my apartment application was approved, I felt a joy I hadn't experienced since childhood. My own space where no one would borrow my shampoo or eat the leftover pizza from the fridge. The first few days in the new apartment were pure bliss. I set up my small vinyl record collection in the living room, hung posters of my favorite sci-fi movies, and even bought myself a real plant, a succulent I named Spock. But my peace lasted only 9 days. 2 of my college friends, David and Marcus, lived in the same building on the 4th floor, while my apartment was on the 2nd. They stopped by for coffee a few times, reminiscing about college and discussing plans for the future. Everything was casual and pleasant, until they crossed the line. They started showing up unannounced, bringing beer, staying late. When one evening they stayed until 3 in the morning, even though I had to be up for work at 6, I hinted that I needed time for myself. "Sure, dude, we totally get it," said David, but there was something fake in his voice that made me wary. The next evening they appeared again, this time with several bags of takeout food and suitcases. "Listen, we've got a problem," Marcus began, not looking me in the eye. "We got evicted yesterday. Nothing serious, just a small dispute with the landlord about noise. Can we stay with you for a few days until we find a new place?" I froze. Part of me wanted to close the door in their faces, but another part, the one that remembered how we studied for exams together and helped each other, couldn't refuse. "1 week," I said firmly. "Maximum 1 week." 1 week turned into 2, then into a month. My small apartment started to resemble the dorm I had so desperately wanted to escape. They didn't clean up after themselves, invited people I didn't know, and worst of all, I noticed my things were disappearing. At first, small items, a phone charger, a few books, then my favorite watch that I had received as a gift from my grandfather. When I tried to talk to them about it, they always brushed it off. "You probably misplaced it yourself, dude. We didn't take anything." One morning I woke up to a strange smell. It was sweet, but with an unpleasant undertone, like something rotting. The smell was coming from the kitchen. Opening the refrigerator, I saw some strange jars with dark liquid. None of them had labels. "What is this?" I asked David when he finally woke up at noon. "Oh, that. Just homemade tincture," he shrugged. "We're testing a new recipe. Want to try some?" Something in his smile made me decline. That same evening, when they went to a bar, I decided to look through their things. I hate to admit it, but I needed to know what was going on. Under Marcus's bed, I found a box. Inside were documents, not theirs, but of people I didn't know. Driver's licenses, credit cards, even a few passports. And my grandfather's watch. Cold fear ran down my spine. Who were these guys really? That night I couldn't sleep. I decided to wait until morning, go to work as usual, and then have a direct conversation with them in the evening. But something inside told me there was no time. At 3 in the morning, I heard the front door open. They had returned from the bar earlier than usual. I pretended to be asleep, but through the crack of my half-open bedroom door, I could see them in the living room. They were speaking in whispers, but fragments of words reached me. "Tomorrow night. Then get rid of. No one will know." The next morning I went to work as usual, but instead of returning home, I drove to the police station. The officer listened to my story, but didn't seem very convinced. "Without evidence of a crime, there's not much we can do," he said. "If you allowed them to stay, technically they're not trespassers. We can send a patrol, but..." I realized I couldn't count on the police. Returning home, I started planning. I sent a message to my neighbor on the first floor, Carl, explaining the situation and asking permission to spend the night at his place. Then I packed my most essential belongings in a backpack and hid it behind the couch. That night, I told the guys I was going to a corporate party and would be back late. "Celebrate without me," I said, trying to sound casual. Instead, I went to Carl's, and we watched my apartment from his window. Around midnight, I noticed two more people I had never seen before entering my apartment. One of them was carrying a large gym bag. I called emergency services. "There are strangers in my apartment. They might be armed," I said, trying to sound as calm as possible. This time, the police responded quickly. 4 patrol cars arrived within 10 minutes. When the officers burst into the apartment, David and Marcus tried to escape via the fire exit, but were detained. In that gym bag, they found surgical gloves, plastic zip ties, duct tape, several syringes filled with some liquid, and most frightening of all, detailed records of my schedule, my habits, and contacts. They were planning something terrible, and I was their target. As it turned out later, David and Marcus weren't even their real names. They were part of a criminal group involved in identity theft and extortion. They had never been my real college friends. They just used information from social media to gain my trust. Now, 3 years after those events, I live in a different city, in a house with a reliable security system. I've become much more cautious in my interactions and never take people at face value. Sometimes I wake up at night, look at my grandfather's watch that the police returned to me, and think about how close I came to being just a name in police reports. But what scares me the most is the thought that I invited these people into my life myself. So be careful who you open your door to. Not all strangers remain strangers. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.